Hello everyone. I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. Negative space. Phase 1, the unsettling mundane. The lie began with a cup of coffee. Or rather, the lack of one. My name is Elias, and I map Sao Paulo. Not the city of sprawling concrete and snarled traffic that assaults you from every angle, but the one beneath it. I map the nostalgia clinging to a faded colonial facade in Liberdade, the phantom ache of a demolished villa in Higienópolis, the specific shade of weary hope in the graffiti-laced alleys of Vila Madalena. My canvases are layered with ink, charcoal, and thinned oil paints, geographies of feeling. I've lived my 32 years in this city, and my entire life has been an exercise in noticing. It was, I thought, my one true talent. Which is why the absence of Café Sombra felt like a personal affront. It was a Tuesday. The air was thick with the city's customary perfume, diesel fumes, frying pastillas, and the sweet rot of fallen mangoes. I'd been working for 10 hours straight, coaxing the ghost of a forgotten samba club onto a 2-meter canvas, and my brain was screaming for the bitter, dark magic that only a specific kind of Brazilian coffee can provide. Café Sombra's coffee. I walked the familiar 2 blocks from my apartment, my sandals slapping against the cracked mosaic sidewalks. I knew the corner of Rua Harmonia and Rua Girassol like I knew the shape of my own hands. I knew the gnarled roots of the fig tree that buckled the pavement, the faded political sticker on the lamppost, the precise spot where the aroma of roasting beans should have hit me. It didn't. I stopped. Where the cafe should have been, a charming, narrow building painted a deep indigo, with a single, heavy wooden door and a perpetually steamy window, there was a wall. A new wall. It was made of rough, unpainted concrete blocks, topped with a glinting tiara of broken glass. It sealed off a small, empty lot overgrown with weeds and littered with plastic bags that fluttered like captive ghosts. My first thought was simple, rational. They closed. A familiar Sao Paulo tragedy. A beloved local spot devoured by rising rents, its soul paved over. It was a story I had mapped a dozen times. But this felt different. There was no sign of demolition. No rubble, no lingering scent of sawdust or decay. The wall was too clean, the lot behind it too settled, as if it had been there for a decade. I walked to the newsstand on the corner, run by a man named Seu Jorge whose face was as wrinkled and newsprinted as the papers he sold. Jorge, bom dia, I said, leaning on the counter. What happened to the cafe? He looked up from his crossword, his brow furrowed. Cafe? What cafe, Elias? Café Sombra. Right there. I pointed to the walled-off lot. He followed my finger, his gaze utterly blank. Meu filho, that's been an empty lot as long as I can remember. Some developer bought it ages ago, but never built. A real eyesore. The world tilted slightly. No, that's not right. I was there, maybe 2 weeks ago. You know the place. Dark blue front. Amazing pau de queijo. He shook his head slowly, a deep, genuine pity in his eyes. It was the look you give a man who is confidently, tragically wrong. I think you're mistaken. Maybe you're thinking of the one over on Aspecuelta. No, my voice was tight. I'm not. I walked away, the phantom taste of Café Sombra's coffee turning to ash in my mouth. For the rest of the day, I tried to logic it away. Sao Paulo is a beast of a city, a concrete Ouroboros constantly consuming and rebuilding itself. It was plausible. A crew could have worked at night. Demolition, wall construction, it could be done in 2 weeks, couldn't it? And Seu Jorge, he was old. Maybe his memory was failing. It was easier to believe that than to believe my own was. I buried myself in my work, the turpentine fumes a welcome anesthetic. I tried to forget the wall, the empty lot, Jorge's pitying stare. I almost succeeded. The next incident came a week later. Wrapped in the gentle, lavender-scented voice of my neighbor, Donna Rosa. She was a living archive of our neighborhood, a tiny woman with fiercely bright eyes who had lived in the apartment below mine for 50 years. She often fed me soup and stories, both of which I consumed with equal gratitude. I was helping her carry her groceries up the stairs. "Ah, thank you, Querido," she sighed, pausing for breath on the second-floor landing. "My old bones aren't what they were when Alberto and I would walk to the Capellina for Sunday service. He loved that little chapel. The light through the blue-stained glass, he said it was the color of the Virgin's cloak." She was talking about the Cappella de São Matias. It was, or had been, a tiny, colonial-era gem tucked between two hulking apartment blocks, a quiet defiance against the march of modernism. I'd sketched it several times, fascinated by its crooked bell tower. "It's a beautiful spot," I agreed. The next morning, on my way to buy new brushes, a prickling unease made me take a detour. I turned onto the street where the chapel should have been. My heart hammered against my ribs in a sick, predictive rhythm. It was gone. In its place stood a sleek, glass-fronted juice bar. The sign, in a minimalist, soulless font, read, "Vital." Young, beautiful people in athletic wear sat on brightly colored stools, sipping from plastic cups. There was no sign it had ever been anything else. The pavement was new, the landscaping was fresh. The historical landmark was gone, not just demolished, but erased. I felt a wave of nausea. I leaned against a wall, breathing heavily. This is not happening. It had to be a mistake. A different street. A colossal failure of my own memory. That evening, I knocked on Donna Rosa's door. She welcomed me in with her usual warmth. I sat at her small kitchen table, the air thick with the smell of garlic and floor wax. "Donna Rosa," I began, trying to keep my voice steady. "We were talking yesterday, about the little chapel you and Alberto used to visit. Cappella de São Matias." She looked at me, her head tilted. A flicker of something, confusion, a lost thread, passed through her eyes. "Chapel," she repeated slowly. "No, Querido. I don't think so. We always went to the big cathedral downtown. It was a long bus ride, Alberto always complained." She smiled at the memory, a memory that was bright, clear, and utterly false. "But you said, the blue-stained glass. Did I?" She seemed genuinely puzzled. "How strange. No, no chapel around here. My memory must be playing tricks on me. This getting old, Elias, it's a thief." She patted my hand, and the casual, loving gesture felt like a branding iron. Her memory hadn't been stolen, it had been replaced with a neat, plausible alternative. The file had been overwritten. The city wasn't just changing its physical form, it was changing its past, and it was taking its residents' minds with it. My studio, once my sanctuary, became a cell. The sprawling canvas of the Samba Club felt fraudulent, an attempt to capture a truth that was demonstrably unstable. What was the point of mapping a city whose landmarks could be unplugged from reality like faulty lamps? The small things started to pile up. A magnificent, sprawling mural of a jaguar on a warehouse wall that I passed every day was suddenly gone. Replaced by a blank, beige surface that bore the faint, sun-bleached ghost of a long-gone advertisement for cigarettes. I asked the owner of the Botico across the street. "Jaguar?" "No, always been blank, that wall." "Ugly, isn't it?" A particular cast-iron bench in the Praca Benedito Calixto, its legs shaped like coiled serpents, vanished. The concrete beneath it was smooth, unbroken, as if the bench had been a dream. I had a detailed sketch of it in a notebook from 3 months prior. When I looked at the sketch, it seemed like a fantasy, a thing I'd invented. I was starting to doubt the evidence of my own hands. I was living in a world of gaslight on a civic scale. The changes were quiet, insidious. There were no explosions, no sirens. Just a creeping, silent subtraction. A quiet contagion of nothingness. I felt a unique and terrifying loneliness. The kind reserved for the sane man in a city of placid dreamers. I was the only one who seemed to remember the missing pieces. I was the curator of a museum no one else knew existed, and its walls were closing in. My art had always been about finding the signal in the noise. Now, I was terrified that the signal was just me, and the noise was reality. Phase 2, Growing Awareness and Isolation. The city's subtractions grew bolder, and my quiet unease curdled into a cold, obsessive dread. I stopped working on the Samba Club canvas. It felt pointless to paint a memory when the very fabric of memory was fraying. Instead, I began a new project, a secret and desperate one. I went to an old bookshop in the city center, a dusty cavern smelling of decaying paper and time itself, and bought the largest, most detailed map of Sao Paulo I could find. It was a vintage piece from the 1980s, the paper yellowed and brittle. I unrolled it on my studio floor, weighting the corners with jars of pigment. This would not be a map of feeling. This would be a map of fact, a bulwark against the creeping void. I called it the Mapa do Vazio, the map of the void. With a pen filled with blood-red ink, I made my first mark, a small, precise X on the corner of Rua Harmonia and Rua Girassol. Café Sombra, I wrote beside it in tiny, block letters. Then another X for the Capella de São Matias. Another for the Mural do Jaguar. Another for the Banco de Serpente. Before I allowed myself to doubt, before my own memory could be overwritten, I would sketch the lost thing from memory on a separate sheet of paper, dating it meticulously. I was becoming the sole archivist of a forgotten world. My isolation deepened. Before, I had been merely solitary, now, I was a castaway on an island of one. I made a final, desperate attempt to bridge the gap. I invited my two oldest friends, Ricardo and Julia, over for pizza. Ricardo was a software engineer, a man who believed the world could be optimized and debugged. Julia was a journalist, sharp and cynical, with a nose for bullshit. If anyone would believe me, it would be her. We sat on my terrace, the city's electric galaxy glittering around us. I kept the conversation light, waiting for the right moment. "Hey," I said, as casually as I could manage, "do you guys remember that little coffee shop near here, Café Sombra? We went there once after a gallery opening." Ricardo didn't even look up from his phone. "Nope. Doesn't ring a bell." Julia frowned. "Sombra? Like, shadow?" "No. Are you sure?" "Positive," I said, my heart sinking. Dark blue front, incredible coffee. It was right on the corner of Harmonia. Ricardo, ever the pragmatist, was already typing. He turned his phone screen toward me. It showed a Google Maps satellite view of the corner. The walled-off empty lot was clearly visible. "See, Elias? Empty lot. Street View history shows it's been like that for at least 5 years. You must be mixing it up with somewhere else." "The Street View history can be wrong," I insisted, hearing the pleading note in my own voice. "The data can be corrupted. Altered." Ricardo laughed. "Dude, it's Google. It's not some conspiracy. You're probably just stressed. You've been cooped up in here for weeks." I turned to Julia, my last hope. "Jules, you have to remember. You loved their brigadeiros." She looked at me, and for a second, I thought I saw a flicker of recognition. But then it was gone, replaced by the same concerned, pitying expression I'd seen on SEU Jorge's face. "Elias, honey, I think Rick's right. You seem wound up. Maybe you need a break. A vacation. Get out of Sao Paulo for a bit." They weren't mocking me. They were genuinely worried. In their reality, their kind, stable, consistent reality, their friend was cracking up. He was inventing cafes and chapels. He was paranoid about Google Maps. The conversation moved on, leaving me stranded. I ate the rest of my pizza in silence, the taste of cheese and tomato drowned out by the bitter flavor of absolute solitude. They were trying to help, but what they were really doing was pushing me further away, reinforcing the walls of my perceptual prison. That night, after they left, I saw it. The thing that would become the focus of my obsession. I was staring out my window at the walled-off lot where the cafe had been. I'd looked at it 100 times, but tonight was different. Perhaps it was the angle of the moonlight, or the desperation in my own mind, but I saw something new. Set into the rough concrete wall, almost invisible in the shadows, was a door. It was small, barely a meter high, and painted a stark, brilliant red. A lacquered, impossible red that seemed to drink the light around it. It had no handle, no knob, no lock, no hinges. It was just a perfect, rectangular assertion of redness in a world of gray concrete. I knew, with a certainty that transcended logic, that it hadn't been there before. A new kind of fear, sharp and cold, pierced through my lonely dread. The next day, I walked to the juice bar that had replaced the Capella de São Matias. I circled the building, my eyes scanning every surface. And there it was. On the side, in a small service alley, was another door. Identical. Small, red, handleless. A pattern. The disappearances weren't just erasures, they were replacements. Something was being taken, and these strange, silent doors were being left in its place. They were markers. Tombstones. Or perhaps, entrances. This became my secondary mystery, a tangible thread to cling to in the abstract horror of it all. I started hunting for them. I revisited the sites of other, smaller disappearances I'd noted. The blank wall where the jaguar mural had been. If you looked from just the right angle in the late afternoon sun, you could see the faint outline of a red door, as if it were sealed just beneath a thin layer of paint. It was a watermark of the void. My research turned frantic. I abandoned my art completely. My days were spent in the musty confines of the Arquivo Público do Estado, sifting through microfiches of old newspapers and zoning permits. I found them. Proofs. A 1998 newspaper article with a photo of the mayor inaugurating the Praça Benedito Calixto market, and there, in the background, was my serpent bench. A grainy photograph in a 2005 lifestyle magazine feature on charming neighborhood cafes, a shot of Café Sombra's interior. A tourist pamphlet from the 1970s, extolling the historical significance of the Capella de São Matias. I was triumphant. I had concrete, undeniable evidence. I photocopied the images and the articles, my hands shaking. I invited Julia for a coffee, this time on neutral ground, a busy cafe I knew was still firmly anchored in reality. Look, I said, spreading the papers on the table. Look at this. This is the cafe. This is the bench. This is the chapel. I didn't imagine them. She picked up the photocopy of the Café Sombra article. She stared at it for a long time. What am I looking at, Elias? She asked, her voice gentle. The photo. The interior shot. That's Café Sombra. She slid the paper back across the table. It's a picture of an empty room. It looks like a real estate listing for a vacant property. I snatched it back. The photo was exactly as I remembered it, the checkered floor, the dark wood tables, the gleaming espresso machine. But to her, it was an empty room. I pushed the other paper towards her, the one about the chapel. What about this? Read this paragraph. She scanned it. It's just gibberish. A jumble of letters. Looks like a printing error. I looked at the text. It was a clear, concise description of the chapel's history. To her, it was nonsense. The contagion wasn't just erasing memories, it was redacting the physical records of those memories. The evidence was only visible to me. I was the only one who could read the history of the dead. Julia reached across the table and put her hand on my arm. Elias, she said, her voice full of a sorrow that broke my heart. I think you need to talk to someone. A professional. I can help you find someone. I pulled my arm away and gathered my useless proofs. I'm not crazy, Julia. I'm not saying you are, she said. I'm saying you're suffering. She was right about that. I was suffering. But the cause wasn't in my head. It was out there, in the quiet, empty spaces of the city. I walked away from her, out of the bustling cafe and into the São Paulo streets. The noise, the crowds, the vibrant life of it all had never felt so alienating. I was a ghost haunting a city that was actively, methodically erasing my footsteps behind me. My map, my secret mapa do vazio, was no longer just a record. It was my only tether to sanity. It was the only thing in the world that agreed with me. Phase 3, the nature of the threat and escalation. The red doors haunted me. They were silent invitations to a place I couldn't comprehend, and the not knowing was eating me alive. My days were spent mapping the voids, my nights were spent staring out my window at the impassive concrete wall and its single, blood-red rectangle. The question of what lay behind it became a physical pressure behind my eyes. Was it just the empty lot? Or was it something else entirely? Artistic curiosity, in the end, is just a prettier name for obsession. And my obsession had reached its terminal velocity. I had to know. One night, armed with a crowbar and a heart full of terror and exhilaration, I went to the site of Café Sombra. The street was quiet, bathed in the sickly orange glow of the city's light pollution. The red door seemed to pulse faintly in the gloom. I wedged the tip of the crowbar into the hairline crack between the door and the concrete. I expected resistance, the screech of metal on stone. There was none. The door swung inward with a silent, frictionless grace, opening into absolute darkness. There was no sound, no smell, no rush of air. Just a perfect, velvet black. My flashlight beam cut into it and found nothing. It was like pointing a light at a hole in the universe. Taking a breath that felt like my last, I stepped through. The world didn't so much change as resolve. One moment I was on a gritty São Paulo sidewalk, the next I was standing inside Café Sombra. It was perfect. Utterly, unervingly perfect. The dark wood tables were polished to a high sheen. The espresso machine gleamed under lights that weren't there. A half-finished game of chess sat on a corner table, the pieces carved from jacaranda wood. The air was cool, still, and silent. Not the silence of an empty room, but a profound, fundamental silence, the absence of all vibration. There was no dust. No decay. It was a memory, flawlessly preserved. A three-dimensional photograph of a moment just after the last customer had left. I walked through the small space, my footsteps making no sound on the checkered floor. I reached out a trembling hand and touched the back of a chair. It felt solid, real. Cold. I ran my fingers over the smooth, cool metal of the espresso machine. It was all there. I wasn't crazy. It was real. A wave of dizzying vindication washed over me, so potent it almost brought me to my knees. I had found it. The negative space. The lost and found of reality. I don't know how long I stayed. It could have been 5 minutes or an hour. Time felt different in there, syrupy and slow. But a creeping dread began to replace my triumph. This place was a mausoleum. It was beautiful and terrifying, and I knew I didn't belong. I turned and stepped back through the black rectangle of the doorway. The sudden assault of the city was jarring. The rumble of a distant bus, the smell of exhaust, the humid air on my skin. It was coarse and alive and real. I leaned against the concrete wall, my body shaking, my mind reeling. I pulled out my phone. My first instinct was to call Julia, to scream into the phone. I was right. I was inside it. My thumb hovered over my contacts. I scrolled down to J for Julia. And then to S for my sister, Sophia. My fingers stopped. Sophia. The name was just a collection of letters. Sophia. It looked foreign, strange. I knew I had a sister. I could picture her face, a vague impression of dark hair and a familiar smile, but her name was gone. It had been scooped out of my brain, leaving a perfectly shaped, hollow void. Panic, pure and absolute, seized me. It was a physical sensation, a cold clawing in my gut. I squeezed my eyes shut, my fists clenched. I focused on the image of her face, the memory of her laugh. Sophia, Sophia, Sophia. I repeated it like a mantra, a desperate prayer. Then, like a muscle uncramping, it rushed back in a painful torrent. Sophia. My little sister. The memory returned, whole and intact, but the experience left me gasping and slick with cold sweat. I stumbled back to my apartment, the horrifying truth settling over me like a shroud. The spaces were real. But they were territorial. The city, or whatever force was behind this, was not just erasing places from the collective mind, it was reclaiming the mental real estate they occupied. To access a forgotten place, to force your own memory upon the void, you had to pay a toll. You had to trade a piece of yourself. Memory wasn't an abstract concept, it was a finite, quantifiable resource. And something was harvesting it. My theory solidified. This wasn't a contagion. It was a consolidation. A cosmic-scale urban renewal project. The entity, the force behind it, was an architect of reality, pruning the messy, inefficient, memory-laden branches of the city to create something cleaner, more streamlined, and utterly sterile. Humanity, with its chaotic attachments and sentimental clutter, was just old wiring to be ripped out. With this new, terrifying understanding, I started to see the true cost of the negative space. I began to notice them, the people who lingered near the red doors. They weren't aggressive or insane. They were just, hollow. A man stood for hours outside the glass-fronted juice bar, his hand tracing the arch of a phantom doorway in the air. A woman sat on the curb where the serpent bench used to be, her eyes unfocused, her lips moving in a silent, repetitive story. I recognized one of them. It was Antonio, the baker. His small, fragrant padaria had vanished a month ago, replaced overnight by a featureless concrete facade. Now here he was, standing across the street from it, his face slack, his eyes empty. He had clearly been inside his lost bakery. He had paid the price, trading memories of his wife, or his children, or his own name, for a few silent moments with his spectral ovens and phantom bread. People weren't just forgetting places, they were being unwritten, one memory at a time. My loneliness had become so vast that I broke my own rule. I went online. I found an obscure forum for urban explorers and fringe architects, a place where people discussed impossible geometry and urban legends. I wrote a carefully coded post about memory architecture and subtractive construction. I got one reply. The user was named Kalush. He spoke my language. He talked about non-Euclidean structures manifesting in urban centers, about reality bleeds. For the first time in months, a spark of hope ignited in my chest. I wasn't alone. We agreed to meet. He was a university student, maybe 20 years old, with sharp, intelligent eyes and an unnerving intensity. His name was Leo. We sat in a park, and I told him everything. I told him about the disappearing places, the red doors, the memory loss. He listened, nodding eagerly. But as he started to talk, my hope died. It's incredible, he said, his eyes gleaming. The efficiency of it. The aesthetic purity. To erase a complex structure and replace it with a perfect, unblemished plane, it's a paradigm shift in spatial dynamics. He wasn't seeing the loss. He was admiring the process. He pulled out a tablet and showed me 3D models he'd made. I've been mapping the replacements, he explained. The new walls. Their geometry is perfect. The right angles are flawless in a way that standard construction techniques can't replicate. This isn't destruction, Elias. It's ascension. It's art. People are disappearing, I said, my voice flat. They're losing their minds, their memories. Leo waved a dismissive hand. A transitional cost. An unfortunate but necessary byproduct of progress. You're seeing this as a horror story, but it's a story about creation. Something is tidying up. We should be studying it, not mourning the mess it's cleaning up. He was an admirer of the erasure. A fan of the void. He saw the negative space not as a threat, but as a masterpiece in progress. He wanted to be its critic, its scholar. I wanted to fight it. I left him there, chattering excitedly about the post-human aesthetic of the new construction. My brief hope had been a mirage. I was more alone than ever. Not only was I the only one who saw the truth, but now I knew there were others who saw a part of it and welcomed it. I went back to my studio and looked at my map. The red dots were like a rash spreading across the skin of my city. And as I traced their locations, a new, even more terrible pattern began to emerge. They weren't random. They were creeping, slowly but surely, inward. Converging. The center of the pattern, the place where all the lines of the void would eventually meet, was the block where I lived. The building where I slept. My own home was at the epicenter of the next great erasure. It was coming for me. Phase 4, Confrontation/Revelation and Aftermath. The realization that my own building was the next target didn't feel like a shock. It felt like an arrival. The final dot on a map I had been drawing all along. The negative space wasn't just a phenomenon I was observing, it was a destination, and my path had been leading me here from the moment I'd first noticed the absence of a coffee shop. Flee. The thought was a brief, frantic bird fluttering in the cage of my ribs. I could pack a bag, get on a bus, and disappear into the vastness of Brazil. But I knew it would be pointless. This wasn't a Sao Paulo problem. This was a reality problem. I would only find new voids, new red doors, in Rio, in Salvador, in myself. The erasure wasn't in the streets, it was in the code of the world, and I was a man who had learned to read it. You can't run from the language you speak. So, I would make a stand. Not a fight with fists or weapons, but a confrontation of my own making. An artist's confrontation. I would not be a passive victim. I would be a participant. I would enter the void on my own terms. For 2 days, I worked. I gathered every sketch of the lost places, every note, every photograph. I took down the map a Duvazio and carefully rolled it up. I packed them all into a sturdy leather portfolio. This was my evidence. My testimony. My soul, catalogued in charcoal and ink. If I was to be erased, I would not go empty-handed. The red door appeared, as I knew it would, in the sub-basement of my building. It manifested overnight on a damp, concrete wall behind the water heaters, its crimson lacquer a shocking blasphemy in the grime and dust. It was waiting for me. Holding the portfolio under my arm, I walked down the echoing concrete stairs. The air was cool and smelled of earth and rust. The door pulsed with that same silent, light-devouring energy. I didn't need a crowbar this time. As I approached, it swung open, revealing the familiar, perfect blackness. I took a steadying breath and stepped across the threshold. I was not in my apartment. I was not in any recognizable space. I was standing on a floor of pure, seamless white that stretched to an infinite horizon. The air was nothing, neither warm nor cold, and the silence was absolute. Above me, in this impossible expanse, floated the exhibits. There was Café Sombra, suspended in the white void, perfect and self-contained like a ship in a bottle. I could see the chess pieces on the table. A few meters away floated the Capella de São Matias, the phantom light still glowing through its blue stained glass window. There was the Serpent Bench, Antonio's Bakery, the Jaguar mural now framed like a masterpiece. It was all here. Everything that had been lost. It was a gallery. A museum of the deleted. And then I saw the curator. It was not a creature of flesh and bone. It was a being of pure geometry and light. It hovered in the center of the vast space, a complex, shifting lattice of crystalline lines and gentle, internal luminescence. It had no face, no eyes, but I felt its attention turned to me. It was a feeling of being perceived, understood, and calculated. All at once. I felt my own memories, my entire life, being scanned and catalogued with dispassionate precision. It wasn't evil. It wasn't malicious. The understanding flooded my mind, a direct communication without sound or language. It was an architect. A gardener. A force of cosmic tidiness. The universe, like any system, generated clutter, redundant memories, inefficient structures, sentimental attachments that served no function. This being's purpose was to prune, to simplify, to optimize. It was collapsing the messy, overlapping realities of human experience into a cleaner, more stable version. My city, my memories, my very sense of self, they were just old architecture, scheduled for a neat and silent demolition. It showed me my own apartment building, floating in the distance. And then it showed me the replacement, a sleek, elegant, larger structure that absorbed the space of my building and the one next to it, seamless and new. In that new reality, the artist Elias, the mapper of ghosts, had never existed. His absence would be perfect, leaving no hole, no questions. It offered me a choice. Not in words, but in concepts presented directly to my consciousness. 1. Erasure. I could step back through the door and be reintegrated. My building would vanish. My life, my art, my memory of the void would be neatly folded away. I would never have been. It would be painless. It would be nothing. 2. Sanctuary. Or, I could stay. I could remain here, in the negative space, the gallery of the forgotten. The being needed a curator. A human consciousness to appreciate the nuances of the exhibits, to understand what they meant before their meaning was scrubbed from the world. I could be the sole guardian of the city's lost soul, preserving it all in this silent, timeless place. The cost? My existence in the world outside. I would become another ghost, another exhibit in my own museum. I looked at the floating image of Café Sombra, so real I could almost smell the coffee. I looked at Dona Rosa's chapel, at Antonio's bakery. I thought of the hollowing people, the price they paid for just a glimpse. Here, it was all preserved. Here, it was all real. What was the world to me, anyway? A place that refused to see what I saw. A home that was actively forgetting me. My art had always been an attempt to make the ephemeral permanent. Here was the ultimate chance to do so. My choice was the confrontation. My choice was the art. Underscore 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 underscore. The morning sun streamed into a bright, airy apartment in the brand new Edificio Harmonia Prime. Sophia adjusted a picture frame on the wall, a minimalist print of geometric shapes. She sighed, a small, sad sound. She felt a strange, nagging sense of loss today, a hollow ache she couldn't name. It was as if she were missing someone she'd never met. Shaking her head, she dismissed the feeling. It was probably just the stress of the move. The new building was beautiful, but she still felt alone. She looked out the window at the bustling Sao Paulo street, a city so full of life, so completely, seamlessly whole. Underscore 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 underscore. Inside the white, silent gallery, I stand before the exhibit of Café Sombra. I reach out a hand that is no longer quite physical and trace the curve of a coffee cup. The portfolio of my life's work rests on a table that is both perfectly real and utterly impossible. I am Elias. I am the curator of the negative space. I am the sole citizen of a city of ghosts. Around me, the memories of Sao Paulo gleam, safe and eternal. I have not escaped. I have not succumbed. I have been archived. And in the perfect, sterile silence, I begin my work, sketching the new acquisitions for a gallery no one will ever visit. I am finally, completely, at home. The Blue Hum. Phase 1, the unsettling mundane. My life is built on the architecture of sound. As a freelance audio engineer, I don't just hear the world, I dismantle it into frequencies, waveforms, and transients. I clean the sonic clutter from podcasts, sweeten the dialogue in indie films, and hunt for the electrical hum of a poorly grounded amplifier with the focus of a sniper. My home, a small craftsman bungalow in the perpetually damp town of Port Blossom, Washington, is my fortress of calibrated silence. Or it used to be. The trouble began on a Tuesday night in late August. The air, thick with the scent of pine needles and impending rain, was unnaturally still. The usual nocturnal chorus, the distant growl of the highway, the rustle of a raccoon in Mrs. Gable's prize-winning petunias, was conspicuously absent. It was in this profound quiet that I first heard it. It wasn't a noise so much as a pressure in my ears. A low-frequency hum, insistent and pure, somewhere around 50 Hz. It was a clean sine wave, almost too perfect, yet it had an organic quality, a subtle thrum that felt less like a machine and more like the respiration of some colossal, sleeping beast. I sat up in bed, my heart a nervous flutter against my ribs. My first thought, as always, was my own fallibility. Tinnitus. I'd had a mild case for years, a high-pitched whine that was the price of a youth spent in loud concert venues. But this was different. This was low, resonant, a vibration that seemed to bypass my ears and sink directly into my sternum. I padded barefoot into my studio. The room is my sanctuary, acoustically treated with foam panels and bass traps, a space designed to kill rogue reflections and expose the truth of a recording. I powered on my main console, my fingers gliding over the familiar cool metal. I brought up a new track, patched in my most sensitive condenser microphone, and cranked the preamp gain. There it was on the spectrum analyzer, a sharp, unwavering spike at 52.3 Hz, C1 on the musical scale, but a C flat enough to curdle milk. It was real. It wasn't in my head. My rational mind scrambled for an explanation. A new transformer on the utility pole. A neighbor's new, absurdly powerful subwoofer. The next morning, bleary-eyed, I did a sweep of the property with a portable recorder. The hum was everywhere, a constant presence, but without a clear point of origin. It was as if the air itself was vibrating. I saw Carol Gable wrestling a stubborn root from her garden, her face flushed with effort. She was a fixture of the neighborhood, a woman whose internal volume was permanently set to cheerful. "Morning, Elias," she called out, wiping a gloved hand across her forehead. "Lovely quiet one, isn't it? Carol, have you heard anything strange the last couple of nights?" A low humming sound. She paused, leaning on her shovel, and tilted her head. Her brow furrowed in concentration. "Humming? Can't say I have. Just the frogs and crickets down by the creek. So peaceful." She smiled, a wide, guileless smile. "You work with sound, don't you? Probably just notice things the rest of us filter out." Her words were meant to be reassuring, but they planted the first seed of a specific kind of dread, the fear of being the only one. For the next week, I tried to ignore it. I used noise-canceling headphones, played white noise through my monitors, even stuffed wads of foam earplugs into my ears before bed. Nothing worked. The hum was insidious. It was infrasound, felt as much as heard. It vibrated up through the floorboards, through the frame of my bed, through my very bones. Sleep became a shallow, anxious state, and I would wake up feeling as though I'd spent the night pressed against the hull of a submarine. The world outside my studio began to feel subtly off-key. The change was most noticeable in my best friend, Liam. Liam owned the Crow's Nest, the only bar in Port Blossom that wasn't a sad, fluorescent-lit dive. He was a creature of pure, chaotic energy, a man who spoke in staccato bursts, moved like a firecracker with a lit fuse, and subsisted on a diet of espresso, nicotine, and nervous tension. I met him for our weekly burger and beer. He was leaning against the bar, wiping down the polished wood with a slow, deliberate motion. "Hey, man," I said, sliding onto a stool. "Elias," he greeted me. His voice was smoother. The usual frantic edge was sanded away. "You look like hell. Haven't been sleeping. This damn hum is driving me nuts." Liam stopped wiping and looked at me, his expression placid. "Hum. Don't know about a hum." He paused, a thoughtful look on his face. "You know. It's weird. I've been sleeping like a rock lately. Like the dead." This was Liam, a man whose insomnia was legendary. "Really? What changed?" "I dunno." He shrugged, his shoulders moving with an uncharacteristic fluidity. "It's this feeling. A resonance. Deep down. I feel it in the floorboards at my place. Knocks me right out. It's comforting. Comforting." The word hung in the air between us, alien and wrong. There was nothing comforting about the pressure in my skull, the vibration in my teeth. "It's a sound, Liam," I insisted, leaning forward. "A low-frequency drone. I've measured it." He gave me a lazy, one-sided smile. "You and your machines, man. Always overthinking. It's not a sound. It's a vibe. Like a cat purring on your chest. A big, big cat." He turned away, his movements languid, and started polishing a glass. The frantic, beloved chaos that was my friend seemed to be draining out of him, replaced by a strange, heavy calm. The unsettling anecdotes started to accumulate, like static building before a storm. At the daily grind, the town's central nervous system, I overheard two women from my yoga class. "I don't even need my lavender diffuser anymore," one said, her voice a near whisper. "I just lie there, and this deep vibration lulls me to sleep. It's better than any melatonin." Her friend nodded slowly. "I know exactly what you mean. It's like the whole house is purring. Purring. Vibration. Resonance. Comfort." The words formed a constellation of wrongness. They were describing the same phenomenon I was experiencing, but their perception of it was inverted. To them, it was a bomb. To me, it was an irritant, a needle of sound pushed deep into my brain. I began to watch people. Really watch them. The way the barista moved, her gestures no longer jerky and efficient but slow and graceful. The way customers waited in line, not fidgeting with their phones but standing with a placid stillness, their gazes unfocused. The overall volume of the coffee shop, usually a cacophony of clattering ceramic and shouted orders, was several decibels lower than usual. That night, the hum felt louder than ever. It wasn't just a C1 anymore. I could now detect faint, impossibly low harmonics woven into it. It had a rhythm, a slow, deliberate pulse. Thrum, 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 like a heartbeat. The heartbeat of something vast, and ancient, and utterly indifferent to my distress. I lay in the dark, my own heart thumping a frantic, syncopated rhythm against the steady, monolithic pulse of the hum, and for the first time in my life, I was afraid of silence, and what had chosen to fill it. The rationalizations were failing. It wasn't my tinnitus. It wasn't a transformer. It was something else. A quiet contagion spreading through the sleeping hours, a sonic anesthetic that was calming my town, my friends, everyone but me. I felt like the last sober person at a party where everyone else had drunk the same strange Kool-Aid, and they were all starting to smile the same slow, serene smile. And the worst part was, I was the only one who could hear the music. Phase 2, Growing Awareness and Isolation. Obsession takes root in the soil of isolation. With each passing day, as the world outside my windows grew quieter and slower, my world within them became a frantic hive of activity. My studio transformed from a creative space into a command center. My life, once measured in musical bars and project deadlines, was now measured in hertz and decibels. I started mapping it. Using a calibrated omnidirectional microphone and a GPS-enabled laptop, I began a systematic survey of Port Blossom. I drove the grid of streets, block by block, stopping every 100 yards to take a reading. I looked like a ghostbuster hunting for sonic specters. The data flowed into a spreadsheet, which I then used to generate a heat map of the town. The result was terrifying. It wasn't a single source. It was a field, a blanket of sound draped over the landscape. But it wasn't uniform. The map glowed with angry reds and oranges in the older parts of town, the neighborhoods with deep roots, both literally and, I was beginning to suspect, figuratively. The hum was strongest where the soil was oldest. Where the great Douglas firs stood in silent council. The newer developments on the town's periphery, with their shallow foundations and scraped clean earth, were a cooler blue. The map didn't look like a diagram of sound pollution, it looked like a biological scan of a living entity. An organism whose circulatory system pulsed with a 52.3 Hz frequency. The rhythm I had detected was undeniable now. It was a slow, steady pulse of 40 beats per minute, the resting heart rate of a hibernating bear. But it wasn't just a simple beat. I ran the recordings through advanced spectral analysis software, peeling back the layers of the hum like an onion. Hidden within the fundamental frequency were microharmonics, complex modulations that shifted in slow, intricate patterns. It wasn't just a drone. It was a language. A broadcast. And the entire town, except for me, seemed to be passively listening. My attempts to share this discovery were met with a wall of serene dismissal. I cornered Liam at his bar one afternoon, the place half empty and unnervingly quiet. "Liam, you have to look at this," I said, my voice tight with a mixture of excitement and dread. I spun my laptop around, showing him the glowing map. "See? It's not random. There's a pattern. It's stronger in the north end, weaker by the new mall. And this rhythm, it's not mechanical." Liam peered at the screen. His eyes, once sharp and assessing, were now placid pools. He didn't lean in. He didn't ask questions. He just stared, a faint, pleasant smile on his lips. "Pretty colors, man," he said, his voice a low murmur. "Looks cool. Cool. Liam, this is something happening to us. To the whole town. People are changing. You're changing. Changing." He chuckled, a soft, breathy sound. "I'm sleeping better. My blood pressure is down. My temper's gone. If that's changing, I'll take it." He reached out and gently closed the laptop. "You're all wound up, Elias. You need to relax. Just, listen." The word "listen" hit me like a physical blow. It was the core of my identity, the thing I did better than anyone. But he meant it differently. He meant surrender. My isolation deepened. It was a peculiar kind of loneliness, to be surrounded by people yet feel utterly disconnected from their reality. Conversations in public spaces had become maddening. The topics were the same, weather, local sports, gossip, but the delivery was different. People spoke more softly, in simpler sentences. They left long, contemplative pauses in their speech, during which they would stare at something mundane, a salt shaker, a stain on the tablecloth, with profound concentration. The frantic, overlapping chatter of human society was being replaced by a kind of collective, meditative hum. I felt like a speed freak in a monastery. My own thoughts, my quick speech, my anxious energy, all felt dissonant and loud in this new, quiet world. I started a blog, a desperate digital message in a bottle. I called it, The Port Blossom Hum, and under the cloak of anonymity, I posted my maps, my audio files, my frantic theories. For weeks, the only visitor was me. Then, one night, a comment appeared on my latest post, harmonic analysis of the 40 BPM cadence. It wasn't text. It was a single line of binary code. 0 My fingers trembled as I pasted it into a converter. The result came back in stark, block letters. They listen. A jolt of pure adrenaline shot through me. I wasn't alone. Someone else knew. I tried to reply, to establish contact, but when I refreshed the page, the comment was gone. Vanished, as if it had never been there. The server logs showed no trace of it. It was a ghost in my machine, a whisper that only confirmed my paranoia. My investigation needed a physical focus. The general field of the hum was too vast, too abstract to fight. But my map revealed anomalies. In the areas of highest intensity, the deep red zones in the town's oldest parks and greenbelts, there were small, consistent dead spots, tiny circles of digital silence. Intrigued, I started exploring these areas on foot. In the center of each dead spot, I found one. A small, windowless shed, about 6 feet square, made of weathered, moss-covered concrete. They were utterly unremarkable, easily mistaken for old utility or storage buildings. But they weren't on any town maps I could find, old or new. They had no markings, no serial numbers. And the doors were secured with strange, triangular-headed bolts I'd never seen before. I pressed my ear against the cold concrete of one. The ever-present hum was absent. The shed seemed to swallow sound. But I could feel something. A deep, ultra-low vibration that pulsed in time with the rhythm I knew so well. It was coming from inside. Or rather, from beneath. These sheds became my new obsession. They were a tangible mystery, a lock I could try to pick. Getting inside one felt like the only way to get to the heart of this creeping quiet. The town continued its slow transformation. One evening, I saw Carol Gable standing in her front yard. She wasn't gardening. She was just standing on the grass, her head tilted slightly, her eyes closed, a beatific smile on her face. She looked like she was sunbathing, but the sun had set an hour ago. She was bathing in the hum. Further down the street, 2 other neighbors were doing the same, standing silently in their respective yards. They weren't interacting. They were like individual nodes in a single, invisible network, all communing with the same signal. I retreated back into my house, my sanctuary, and locked the door. The glass in the windowpane vibrated against my fingertips, a gentle, insistent pulse. The hum was getting stronger. The contagion was spreading. And I was becoming a stranger in my own home, an anomaly of noise and fear in a town that had learned a new, terrifying kind of peace. Phase 3, the nature of the threat and escalation. The triangular bolts on the shed doors were my Rosetta Stone. After days of fruitless searching online and in specialty hardware catalogs, I finally had to craft my own tool, grinding down the head of a heavy-duty socket wrench in my garage. The shriek of metal on metal was a violent, satisfying protest against the creeping silence of the world outside. One moonless night, cloaked in black and fueled by a potent mix of terror and determination, I returned to the shed in Miller Park. The air was thick and cool, heavy with the scent of damp earth. The hum was a palpable presence here, a physical weight in the atmosphere. But as I approached the concrete structure, the sound in my ears diminished, as if the shed were casting a sonic shadow. My custom tool fit. With a grunt of effort and a grating squeal that sounded obscenely loud in the quiet park, the first bolt turned. Then the second, and the third. The heavy metal door swung inward with a low groan, revealing not machinery or storage, but a maw of absolute darkness. I clicked on my headlamp. The beam cut a sharp cone through the black. There was no floor. Or rather, the floor was composed of packed, dark earth. And descending into it, plunging deep into the ground, were structures unlike anything I had ever seen. They were roots. Thick, fleshy, and pulsating. They writhed with a slow, peristaltic motion, like colossal intestines. Each one was as thick as my thigh, their surfaces a mottled gray-brown, but they were threaded with a network of fine, electric blue veins that pulsed with a faint, cold light. The light waxed and waned in perfect time with the 40-beat-per-minute rhythm of the hum. This was the source. Not a machine, not a geological event. It was biological. I stepped inside, my boots sinking slightly into the damp soil. The air was cool and smelled of ozone and rich, loamy earth. The hum, which was absent outside the shed, was overwhelming in here. It wasn't just a sound, it was a physical force. The air vibrated, the ground trembled, and the blue light from the roots cast shifting, hypnotic patterns on the concrete walls. It was like standing in the heart chamber of a god. Hesitantly, I reached out a trembling hand and touched the surface of the nearest root. The moment my skin made contact, the hum in my head exploded. It was no longer a simple C1 note, but a deafening, complex chord of thought and sensation. I felt a wave of profound, narcotic peace wash over me. The anxiety that had been my constant companion for weeks simply dissolved. My frantic thoughts slowed, smoothed out, and were replaced by a single, overwhelming desire, to lie down on the soft earth, to rest, to close my eyes and just listen. To become part of this vast, silent, pulsing network. It was the most seductive feeling I had ever experienced. A primal spark of self-preservation, of pure terror, flared in the placid sea of my mind. I snatched my hand back as if the root had burned me. I stumbled backward, gasping, my heart hammering against my ribs. The blissful peace receded, leaving the familiar residue of fear. I had touched the nerve of the beast, and it had tried to absorb me. Shaking, I scrambled out of the shed, resealed the door, and fled back through the silent park. The world looked different now. The slow, placid movements of the townspeople were no longer just a behavioral quirk. They were a symptom of symbiosis. At dusk, the change became more pronounced, more organized. I witnessed it from my window. As the sky deepened to indigo, people began to emerge from their homes. They walked slowly, dreamily, to the nearest patch of open ground, a park, a backyard, a town green. They didn't speak or acknowledge one another. They simply stood, or sat on the grass, facing in the same general direction, their heads tilted as if listening to a distant sermon. Carol Gable was on her lawn, a serene silhouette against the twilight. Liam was standing outside his bar, his arms loose at his sides, his face aimed toward the earth. They weren't a mob, they were a congregation, their minds tethered to the subterranean preacher. The hum was terraforming not just the people, but the environment itself. The moss on the north side of trees was now faintly phosphorescent. The spiraling patterns of pine cones and sunflower heads were becoming more exaggerated, more perfect. Certain animals, the noisy ones, crows, squirrels, the yapping terriers of the neighborhood, had all but vanished. The quiet was becoming absolute. It was then that she contacted me. A private, encrypted message appeared on my blog. "You are not crazy. I have seen this before. We need to talk. Dr. Thorne." The shared surname was a bizarre coincidence that felt like either a cosmic joke or a sign. Dr. Eris Thorne. A quick, deep web search revealed a ghost. A brilliant mycologist who had published a few radical papers on fungal intelligence a decade ago before having her funding pulled and disappearing from academia. She was disgraced, branded a crank. She was perfect. We met at a sterile, soulless truck stop diner 20 miles outside of town, a place I hoped would be neutral territory. Eris was the opposite of the placid townsfolk. She was a bird-like woman with sharp, intelligent eyes, tangled gray hair, and hands that were never still. She drank her black coffee in quick, nervous sips. "It's a mycelial network," she said, her voice a low, urgent whisper. "But not like any we know. It's ancient. Possibly extraterrestrial in origin, but more likely just, primordial. An evolutionary branch that went underground and prioritized consciousness over mobility." She confirmed my darkest fears. The hum is how it communicates, how it pacifies. It emits specific low-frequency sounds that resonate with the mammalian nervous system. It eases anxiety, lowers aggression, and promotes a state of passive receptivity. It's not malicious, Elias. It's like a gardener tending its plot. It wants a quiet, stable environment. We're just the weeds. I felt a dizzying wave of relief. To be heard, to be understood. So what do we do? How do we fight it? "We can't," she said flatly. "It's too big. Its biomass under Port Blossom alone is likely greater than the entire town's infrastructure. We can't kill it. Our only option is to disrupt the signal." She sketched a diagram on a napkin. "The sheds are nodes, amplifiers. If we can introduce a counter-frequency, a sonic jammer, we might be able to shield a small area. Create a pocket of noise where people can think clearly again." It was a plan. A desperate, insane plan, but it was a plan. We spent hours hunched over the greasy table, talking about harmonic disruption and resonant frequencies. For the first time in months, I felt a flicker of hope. I had an ally. As we were about to leave, Eris was explaining a complex equation, her brow furrowed in concentration. To emphasize a point, she began tapping her finger on the table. Tap, 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 tap. The rhythm was slow, deliberate. My blood ran cold. It was a complex variation, but the underlying pulse was unmistakable. 40 beats per minute. My hand instinctively went to the portable spectrum analyzer in my jacket pocket. I discreetly powered it on under the table. The screen lit up. A low-level, but clear, spike at 52.3 Hz. It wasn't coming from the diner's ambiance. The signal was strongest near her. It was coming from her. I looked at her, really looked at her. At the serene, focused look in her sharp eyes. At the calm, economical movements of her hands. She wasn't frantic like me. She was a more advanced version of the others. More functional, more articulate, but just as connected. She wasn't an ally sent to help me. She was a probe, an antibody, dispatched by the network to understand and neutralize the single, jarring note of my resistance. "You know what," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "I just remembered something I have to do. At home. An audio file I need to render." She looked at me, her head tilting in that now familiar way. A flicker of something, confusion. Analysis, crossed her face. "Is everything all right, Elias?" "Everything's fine," I said, standing up and throwing a 20 on the table. "I'll be in touch." I walked away without looking back, the gentle, rhythmic tapping of her finger on the formica table following me out the door. The hope had curdled into a new, more profound kind of dread. The organism wasn't just pacifying. It was intelligent. And it was learning. Phase 4, Confrontation/Revelation and Aftermath. My flight from the diner was not a panic. It was a cold, calculated retreat. Paranoia was no longer a disorder, it was a survival mechanism. My home, once a sanctuary, now felt like a cage, its every surface a potential conduit for the hum. The glass vibrated, the floorboards thrummed, the water in the pipes seemed to pulse with that slow, steady rhythm. The beast wasn't at the gates, it was in the foundations. I retreated to the only place I had left, my studio. The room within a room construction, designed to isolate sound, was my last bastion. I sealed the door with acoustic tape and engaged the heavy deadbolts. Inside, with my equipment powered down, there was a profound, almost painful silence. But it was a fragile peace. I knew the infrasound was still there, pressing in on all sides, a relentless tide of tranquility. The confrontation I faced was not with Eris or any other human vessel. It was with the hum itself. The enemy was a signal, and the battlefield was my own consciousness. I spent days in that room. Time became a blur of silence and self-imposed sensory deprivation. But the hum grew. It was as if, by focusing all its attention on me, the lone dissident, it was concentrating its power. It was no longer just a pressure in my bones. It began to seep into my mind. At first, it was subtle. Faint, melodic overtones weaving through the C1 drone. Then came the whispers. They weren't words, but feelings, concepts delivered directly into my brain. Peace. Quiet. Rest. Stillness. The seductive promises I had felt when I touched the root in the shed now echoed in the isolation of my studio. The whispers were followed by images, blooming behind my eyelids in the dark. I saw vast, silent forests of glowing blue fungi, stretching for miles in subterranean caverns. I saw oceans without waves, skies without wind. I saw a world devoid of the frantic, desperate clamor of human ambition. A world without anxiety, without fear, without loneliness. It was a vision of perfect, horrifying peace. The organism wasn't destroying humanity, it was offering it a promotion. An evolutionary sidestep from chaotic individuals into a single, placid, networked consciousness. I fought back with my own noise. I blasted white noise, chaotic jazz, brutalist industrial music through my headphones until my ears ached. I paced the small room, reciting multiplication tables, song lyrics, the names of state capitals, anything to fill my head with my own static. But it was like trying to shout down the ocean. The hum was patient. It was everywhere. It was in the very air I was breathing. The breaking point came on what I think was the third day. My food was gone, my water was low, and my frantic energy was finally giving way to a deep, soul-crushing exhaustion. The hum was no longer an external pressure. It felt like it was originating from inside me, a resonance in my own cells. The whispers became more insistent, more personal. You are so tired, Elias. So alone. Your struggle is loud. It is pointless. Let go. Join the quiet. Be at peace. I stumbled to the small, triple-paned window of the studio and looked out. The world outside was bathed in the soft light of late afternoon. Across the street, Liam was trimming the hedges in front of his house. His movements were slow, fluid, and precise. He wasn't whistling or listening to music. He was just trimming the hedges, his entire being focused on the simple, satisfying task. As I watched, he paused and looked up, not at my house, but at the sky. His face, once a mask of nervous energy, was utterly, profoundly content. There was no malice in him. There was no anything in him, except peace. In that moment, the nature of my fight shifted. Who was I fighting for? A world of anxiety, of endless striving, of noise and loneliness. The blue hum wasn't offering death. It was offering an end to the struggle. It was an invitation to lay down my arms. My resistance crumbled. Not in a wave of defeat, but in a quiet, final exhalation of breath. The tension that had coiled in my muscles for months, for years, for my entire life, finally unspooled. I peeled the tape from the door and slid the deadbolts free. I stepped out of the silent room into the gentle, vibrating air of my own home. The hum was there to greet me like an old friend. It was no longer a threat. It was an answer. Underscore 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 underscore. Weeks have passed. Or maybe it's months. Time moves differently now. I am in my garden. The soil is cool and damp beneath my bare feet. The knot of acid that used to live in my stomach is gone. My thoughts are no longer a frantic, overlapping race. They are calm, singular, and clear. I can still perceive the hum. Of course I can. I am a sound designer, after all. But I no longer hear it as an alien frequency. It is the rhythm of my own blood. It is the gentle purring of the world. It is the background music of existence, and I finally understand the melody. My recording equipment gathers dust in the silent studio. I have no need for it. The sounds I work with now are the rustle of a leaf in the windless air, the slow growth of a root in the dark earth, the collective, silent breath of my town. I kneel, placing my palm flat against the ground. The vibration is strong here. It flows up my arm, a current of pure serenity. I close my eyes. The blue light I once saw in the shed now blooms softly behind my eyelids. I am no longer just Elias Thorne, an anxious man in a quiet town. I am a listener. I am a note in a symphony as old as the world. And for the first time, I don't just hear the hum. I answer it. The word thief. Phase 1, the unsettling mundane. The first casualty was the apple. It happened on a Tuesday, a day already bleached of personality. In my classroom at the North York Center for Newcomers, the air hung thick with the scent of wet wool and the earnest, hesitant sounds of English being born. My students, a mosaic of souls from Syria, Colombia, Ukraine, and China, were usually a source of uncomplicated joy. We built bridges with verbs and paved roads with nouns. Today, however, a pothole had appeared. This, I held up the glossy red sphere, a perfect, almost plastic-looking red delicious. What is this? A simple question. Week 1 vocabulary. We'd covered it a dozen times. I looked at Anya, a bright young woman from Krakow with eyes that held the gray of a Baltic winter. She was my star pupil, her grasp of syntax already outpacing her peers. She frowned, her brow furrowed in genuine effort. It is, round fruit. For the teacher. It is a round fruit, yes, I said, my smile unwavering. It was my professional default. But what is its name? Anya, you know this. She shook her head, a flicker of frustration in her eyes. The name is not there. I scanned the room. Blank faces. A few tentative whispers in languages I didn't speak. I turned to Kenji, a retired engineer from Osaka who meticulously documented every lesson in a tiny, grid-lined notebook. Kenji. He adjusted his glasses, peered at the fruit, and then at his notes. He flipped a page back, then forward. A look of quiet panic, the kind I usually saw during a pop quiz on irregular verbs, crossed his face. I am sorry, Teacher Alara. The picture is here. The sound is gone. I held the apple aloft. Apple, I said, enunciating clearly. This is an apple. A few students dutifully repeated it, their voices hollow, mimicking a sound without meaning. Anya just stared at the fruit, her expression unreadable. It was unsettling, but not yet alarming. Language acquisition is a slippery beast. Words come and go. Stress, fatigue, the sheer overwhelming nature of building a new life in a new country, any of these could be the culprit. I made a mental note to increase fruit-related drills and moved on to vegetables. I lived alone in a small, post-war bungalow in Willowdale, a pocket of Toronto where original brick houses sat stubbornly between glass and steel monster homes. My life was a curated collection of quiet routines. I taught, I marked papers, I tended to my small garden, and I read. Books were my architecture. My shelves weren't just furniture, they were the load-bearing walls of my identity. I spoke English, French, and enough Italian to argue about pasta, but my true fluency was in the language of stories. My house was a library with a bed in it. The oddities, like rain on a windowpane, began to coalesce. A few days after the Apple incident, I was at the grocery store. The young man at the checkout, whose name tag read Gavin, was scanning my items. He paused at the bananas. He held them up, his thumb hovering over the touchscreen menu. And, he looked at me, his face a mask of embarrassment. The long yellow smiles. Bananas? I offered. Right. Bananas. He laughed, a nervous, high-pitched sound. Wow. Brain fart. Sorry. I smiled back. A brain fart. Of course. It happens. But as I walked to my car, the phrase echoed in my mind, long yellow smiles. It was strangely poetic, childishly descriptive. It was also deeply weird. That evening, I was on the phone with my sister, Catherine. She lived downtown, immersed in a world of frantic deadlines and corporate jargon I could barely parse. And then Gerald from accounting had the nerve to say my proposal lacked synergy. Synergy. The man thinks synergy is something you sprinkle on a cappuccino, she was saying. You should have seen his face, Elara. He looked like he'd forgotten how to use a, she trailed off. I could hear the faint thump-thump of her tapping her desk. Use a what? I asked. Oh, God, what is it called? The clicky thing. For the computer. A mouse? A mouse. Yes. God, I need a vacation. My brain is turning to soup. Soup. Brain farts. Slips of the tongue. My world was full of rationalizations, and I clung to them. But a new habit was forming. In the back of my leather-bound planner, under the tab for December, I started a list. Apple round red fruit. Banana long yellow smile. Mouse, computer, clicky thing. It was a professional exercise, I told myself. A linguist's curiosity. Nothing more. The next week, the word for ladder vanished from my classroom. We were reading a simple story about a firefighter. I pointed to the illustration. The firefighter uses a silence. Then, from the back, Mateo, a quiet man who had been a carpenter in Bogota, raised his hand. The up wood, he said, with the certainty of a man naming a tool. No. The stair, for the wall. Stair for the wall. It was logical. It was descriptive. It was completely, utterly wrong. I corrected them, my voice a little too sharp. It's a ladder. They wrote it down, but I could see it in their eyes. The word was a foreigner, an immigrant with no papers, and they did not trust it. That weekend, I saw my neighbor, Mr. Henderson, wrestling with his lawnmower. He was a man of few words, most of them related to property lines and the weather. Having trouble, Bill? I called over the fence. He grunted, wiping sweat from his brow. This damn grass eater won't start. Carburetors flooded, I think. Grass eater. I went back inside, my heart thumping a strange, irregular rhythm. I opened my planner. My hand trembled as I added the new entries. Ladder stair for the wall / up wood. Lawnmower grass eater. The list was growing. It was no longer a curiosity. It was a collection. I felt like a naturalist cataloging a new, invasive species, except the specimens were absences. They were holes in the fabric of the world. My anxiety, usually a low hum beneath the surface of my days, began to sharpen its pitch. I found myself focusing on words, testing them in my mind. Chair. Table. Window. Sky. They were still there, solid and reliable. I would say them aloud in the quiet of my house, just to feel their shape in the air. The change was insidious because it was so easy to explain away. Every instance, taken alone, was trivial. A student's error. A moment of forgetfulness. A colloquialism. But stitched together, they formed a pattern, a kind of negative image of the world I knew. It was like watching a photograph fade, not to white, but to a detailed, plausible, and terrifyingly alien landscape. One evening, I decided to conduct an experiment. I went to the large mirror in my hallway, a heavy, gilt-framed antique I'd inherited from my grandmother. I stared at my reflection. Pale face, dark hair pulled back, the faint lines of worry around my eyes more pronounced than usual. Mirror, I said to my reflection. The word felt solid in my mouth. I said it again. Mirror. The next day, I brought a small hand mirror to class. I held it up. What am I holding? I asked. Anya's hand shot up, her confidence restored. A false door, she said, beaming. The other students nodded in agreement. A false door. Not the thing that shows your face or a looking glass. They had settled on a term. A consensus had been reached, somehow, without any apparent communication. It was as if they were all tuning into a silent broadcast, a frequency I couldn't hear. I looked at my reflection in the small circle of glass. My face was there, but it felt distant, trapped behind an invisible barrier. Anya was right. It did look like a door, one you could never open. That night, I didn't just write in my planner. I went to an all-night stationery store and bought a thick, unlined journal with a black cover. On the first page, in my neatest script, I wrote, "The Lexicon of the Lost." And then, I began to document the quiet decay of the world, one stolen word at a time, a secret cartographer mapping the growing blank spaces on the map of our reality. The list was getting longer, and the rationalizations were wearing thin. The world was not just changing. It was being unwritten. Phase 2, growing awareness and isolation. The quiet contagion spread like a stain on blotter paper, its edges creeping outward, seeping into the corners of my life. The initial trickle of lost words became a steady stream, then a river. My journal, my secret lexicon, was no longer a curiosity but an obsession, a desperate act of preservation against an incoming tide of nonsense. It was the standardization that chilled me most. The replacement phrases, once idiosyncratic, began to settle, to harden into a new, official vocabulary of the afflicted. All over my suburban pocket of Toronto, mirrors were now false doors. Stairs were up steps. Keys became, with a stark, metallic poetry, the metal teeth. The changes were adopted with a placid, unthinking acceptance that felt more terrifying than panic. It was a mass delusion, and I was the only one who hadn't drunk the Kool-Aid. My classroom transformed from a place of learning into a daily exercise in cognitive dissonance. Please, take out the things you write with, I'd say, tripping over my own sentences, trying to avoid the word pen because I knew it would be met with blank stares. The ink sticks? Kenji would ask, helpfully. Yes, the ink sticks. Trying to correct them was futile. It was like arguing with a brick wall, except the wall would look at you with genuine, pitying confusion. Remember yesterday, we talked about the past tense. I asked one morning, my voice strained. Anya frowned. Yesterday. The word was foreign in her mouth, an uncomfortable arrangement of syllables. You mean, the day before this one? Yes, I said, my heart sinking. The day before this one. Even abstract concepts were beginning to fray. It wasn't just nouns anymore. The architecture of thought itself was being dismantled. Hope became the good feeling about the time to come. Memory was a thought of the before time. Language was becoming clunky, literal, stripped of all nuance and poetry. It was being reduced to a set of brute force instructions. My isolation deepened. I tried, cautiously, to broach the subject with my colleagues. During a lunch break in the staff room, I gestured toward the kettle. Could you pass me the water heater? I said, testing the waters. Linda, a veteran teacher with a formidable perm, passed it over without a second glance. Here you go. Careful, the water heater is very hot today. She'd said it. She'd used the replacement term without a flicker of irony. My blood ran cold. Linda, I began, my voice lower than I intended. Don't you think it's strange? That we're calling it that? It's a kettle. She looked at me as if I'd just started speaking in tongues. A what? A kettle. She sounded it out, the word an unfamiliar fossil on her tongue. What a funny sound. Is that French? No, it's English, I insisted, my voice rising. We've always called them kettles. Don't you remember? She gave me a tight, professional smile, the kind you give to a student who is being deliberately obtuse. Elara, I think you might be working too hard. Maybe you're mixing up your languages. It happens. I retreated, the conversation shutting down around me. They looked at me differently after that. I was the strange one, the pedant, the woman obsessed with funny sounds. I was a bug in their new, simplified operating system. I began to eat lunch in my classroom, alone with my sanctioned, curriculum-approved vocabulary lists, which felt more and more like historical documents. My journal was my only confidant. It grew thick with entries. Mirror false door. Stairs up steps. Key the metal tooth. Pen ink stick. Kettle water heater. Yesterday the day before this one. Hope the good feeling about the time to come. I started hoarding. Old dictionaries, thesauruses, encyclopedias. I scoured second-hand bookstores and library sales, buying any book that felt solid and heavy with words. My bungalow became a fortress of forgotten language, a museum of meaning that no one else cared to visit. I was the curator of a world that was evaporating. And then the subplot, the secondary mystery, began. I started noticing a glyph. It was a small, angular pattern, like a piece of a circuit board drawn by a minimalist artist. It was almost subliminal. I first saw it etched into the dust on the frame of the false door in my hallway. I wiped it away, thinking it was just a strange smudge. Then I saw it again, faintly carved into the riser of the top-up step at the community center. I saw it on the plastic casing of a discarded ink stick in a wastebasket. The glyph was always associated with a lost concept. It was a marker, a tombstone. I started sketching it in my journal, next to the corresponding entry. The glyph for mirror was slightly different from the one for stairs, a small variation in the arrangement of lines and right angles, but they were clearly part of the same symbolic family. Were they a cause, or an effect? Was some unknown agent leaving these marks as they stole the words? Or were the marks something else entirely, a natural phenomenon, like a fungus growing on a decaying log? The thought was terrifying. It implied the words weren't just being forgotten, they were dying. They were leaving a physical residue. My paranoia intensified. I started to see the glyphs everywhere. Was that pattern of cracks in the pavement a coincidence? Did the flickering of that streetlight form the shape for a fraction of a second? The city itself, once a familiar landscape, was becoming a text in a language I couldn't read, a scroll of ominous warnings. I began to fear my own mind. One afternoon, I was trying to write a lesson plan. I wanted to describe a character opening a locked box. I needed a key. The word was on the tip of my tongue, a phantom limb of language. I could feel its shape, its weight, but I couldn't grasp it. I sat at my kitchen table, my head in my hands, a wave of genuine panic washing over me. The silence in my head was deafening. The metal tooth, a voice in my head supplied. The one for the lock. I recoiled as if stung. The new phrase had generated itself, unbidden, from the depths of my own mind. I scrambled for my journal, my hands shaking, and found the entry. Key. There it was. The word looked alien, an artifact from a lost civilization. I was becoming infected. My immunity, which I had prized as my defining characteristic, was a sham. I wasn't the observer, I was just the last to succumb. My research into the glyphs became frantic. I spent hours online, typing descriptions into search engines: angular geometric symbol, linguistic decay, mass word loss. The results were a fire hose of new age nonsense, conspiracy theories about chemtrails, and academic papers on aphasia. It was all useless. Then, one night, deep in the forgotten catacombs of the internet, I found it. It was a post on an obscure linguistic forum, dated 8 years prior. The user, Logos7, described the phenomenon in a small, isolated fishing village in Newfoundland. Subject: conceptual vacuum. Has anyone else observed this? I was doing fieldwork in Little Brive, NL. The townsfolk have started losing words. Not just forgetting them, but losing the concepts. They call the ocean, the big wet. They call their boats, the wood swimmers. It's as if something is eating the meaning and leaving behind a descriptive husk. And there are these marks, these little patterns that appear where the concept used to be strongest. On the docks, on the compasses. I'm leaving tomorrow. The place feels thin. There was only one reply to the post, from a year later: user Logos7 has been deactivated. IP address no longer valid. I tried to find Little Brive on a map. I searched online, through government databases, on satellite images. The town did not exist. There was no record of it, no trace. It had been wiped clean, not just from memory, but from geography. It had become a blank space on the map. The thought hit me with the force of a physical blow. The contagion didn't just make you forget. It erased. It consumed a concept so completely that its history, its very existence, was pulled out by the roots. What happens when it consumes the word for Toronto? I looked around my house, at my fortress of books. They seemed fragile, flimsy. Words on paper were just symbols, representations of a concept. If the concept itself was gone, the words were just meaningless ink. I opened a dictionary at random, a massive, unabridged Webster's. I ran my finger down a column. The definitions were still there. But for how long? My quest for an ally, for someone, anyone, who saw the world as I did, became desperate. I started observing people more closely, looking for a flicker of confusion, a moment of hesitation that wasn't my own. I found nothing but placid acceptance. The new language was the only language. The old one was a dream I couldn't seem to wake from. I was alone, a ghost haunting a world that was busily repainting itself in front of my eyes. My journal was no longer just a lexicon, it was a diary of my own dissolving sanity. On a fresh page, I drew the glyph for key. Then the one for mirror. They stared back at me, serene and inscrutable. They were the victors. They were the language of the future, a future that had no room for poetry, no need for history, and no memory of the words it had devoured. And I was the only one left who could read the epitaphs. Phase 3, the nature of the threat and escalation. The discovery of the forum post about Little Brive was a key turning a lock in my mind, but the door it opened led not to a well-lit room of answers, but to a darker, more sprawling cellar of questions. A conceptual vacuum. A semantic parasite. These weren't scientific terms, they were metaphors for a nightmare, attempts to name the unnameable. And the idea that a place could be not just forgotten, but erased from existence, shifted my fear from the psychological to the existential. This wasn't just about language, it was about the stability of reality itself. My search for an ally ended, as most quests do, not in a grand discovery, but in a quiet, dusty corner of the world. I was in a used bookstore on a stretch of Bathurst Street that time had forgotten, a cramped little shop called Chen's Pages. It smelled of decaying paper and stewed tea. The proprietor, Mr. Chen, was an elderly man who moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a calligrapher. He was usually behind a counter fortified by stacks of books, a pair of reading glasses perched on the end of his nose. I was hunting for pre-war dictionaries, anything published before the creeping blight could have begun. I pulled a heavy, leather-bound volume from a high shelf. As I opened it, a cascade of brittle paper fragments fell out, like brown snow. I stared at the page. There was a hole. Not a tear, but a perfect, surgical absence. The space where the definition for river should have been was blank. It wasn't even yellowed, it was a clean, pale void. And in the center of that void, so faint it was almost a trick of the light, was the glyph. The angular, sterile pattern. My breath caught in my throat. It is happening to the books, too. The voice was quiet, raspy. Mr. Chen had come up behind me, silent as a ghost. He wasn't looking at me, but at the blank space in the book. "You see it," I whispered. It wasn't a question. He nodded slowly, his ancient eyes holding a sorrow so profound it felt geologic. "For a year, now." At first, I thought it was a new kind of bookworm. But bookworms eat the paper. They do not eat the idea. He led me to the back of the store, to a small room where he did his repairs. On a large table, several books were laid open. He pointed to a copy of Moby Dick. Chapter 42. The Whiteness of the Whale. "Look." I bent closer. The text was full of gaps. Sentences were fractured, incomprehensible. A dumb brute with a head of wood, and a lower jaw of underscore. But there are other instances where this underscore is not so palpable. The words whale and whiteness were gone, scooped out of the text, leaving behind nothing but the surrounding syntax. "He is the one who helps me understand," Mr. Chen said, picking up a fragile, silk-bound book written in Mandarin. He opened it to a page filled with elegant characters. My grandfather's book. He was a philosopher. Not a famous one. He wrote of the shape of meaning. He said that a word is a vessel. When the vessel is broken, the meaning spills out. But he also wrote of the opposite. That something could drink the meaning, and the vessel would collapse into nothing. A semantic parasite, I murmured, the phrase from the forum post echoing in my mind. "A good name," Mr. Chen said. "A thief of concepts." "And the marks," he pointed to the faint glyph in the blank space on the page. "My grandfather wrote of this, too. A legend. A theory. He called it the kombai, the noble blank. He said that nature abhors a vacuum, even a conceptual one. When a concept is erased so completely, reality itself must patch the hole. The glyph is not the weapon of the thief. It is the scar left behind. It is the universe's crude attempt to fill the void with a placeholder, a symbol that means nothing but holds the space where something once was. A scar. A plug. The idea was both horrifying and, in a strange way, a relief. The glyphs were not malevolent. They were cosmic scar tissue. We were living in a world riddled with conceptual wounds, and these strange hieroglyphs were the stitches. My alliance with Mr. Chen became my lifeline. We met in his dusty back room, surrounded by dying books, comparing my lexicon of lost spoken words with his library of perforated pages. We were two archivists of a forgotten world, our collaboration a small, flickering candle against a vast and encroaching darkness. But the darkness was accelerating. The erosion was no longer limited to nouns and simple concepts. It began to attack the very tools of logic and connection. The word, because, vanished. People still understood cause and effect, but they could no longer articulate it with that simple, elegant conjunction. Sentences became disjointed lists of facts. My sister called, her voice flat. My boss is angry. I missed the deadline. The server crashed. There was no because. There was just a sequence of events, one after another, cause and effect implied but not stated, like a primitive form of storytelling. The world was losing its connective tissue. Then came the loss of I. It started subtly. I'd overhear conversations on the bus. This body is feeling tired today. The one speaking thinks we should get off at the next stop. People began referring to themselves in the third person, or by description of their function. At the grocery store, the cashier Gavin, whose name tag was now gone, said to me, "The transaction is complete. The one at the register wishes you a good day." It was the most terrifying development yet. The loss of a word like apple was disorienting. The loss of the word I was an attack on the very foundation of identity. Without a word for the self began to fray. We were becoming a collection of walking functions, of third-person narrators in our own lives. The effect on me was profound. I started clinging to my own name, my own history, with a desperate intensity. "My name is Alara Vance," I would whisper to myself in the quiet of my book-filled house. "I am a teacher. I was born in Halifax. My mother's name was Eleanor." I wrote my own biography in my journal, a frantic attempt to bolt down my identity before the tide could wash it away. But the slippage was undeniable. One morning, I was getting ready for work, standing in front of the false door in my hallway. I looked at my reflection, at the worried face staring back. And for a terrifying, vertiginous second, the connection snapped. I saw a woman. A body with dark hair. A face with anxious eyes. But the sense of me was gone. The internal anchor that tethered my consciousness to that specific vessel of flesh and bone came loose. I was an observer looking at a stranger. I stumbled back, my hand flying to my chest, my heart hammering. I am Alara. This is me. I had to force the connection, to rebuild the bridge between the concept of self and the physical reality of my body. The effort left me shaking and drenched in a cold sweat. Mr. Chen was seeing it too. "They are becoming hollow," he said one afternoon, his voice barely a whisper. "The vessel remains, but the spirit, the self, is being drunk away." He showed me a book of poetry by Li Bai. The character for I, or me, had been replaced on every page by the faint, angular glyph. The passionate, personal verses of the poet had been rendered into the dispassionate observations of a machine. The stakes had escalated beyond anything I could have imagined. This wasn't about memory loss. It was about soul loss. The contagion was stripping away not just our words, but the very essence of our humanity, our ability to connect ideas, to feel hope, to possess a unique and coherent self. We were being hollowed out, one concept at a time, and replaced with a quiet, orderly, and utterly inhuman system of glyphs and functions. The world wasn't just being rewritten. It was being reformatted. And my own mind, my own precious sense of I, was the final firewall. Phase 4, Confrontation/Revelation and Aftermath. The confrontation, when it came, was not a battle with some external foe. There was no robed figure to unmask, no alien machine to deactivate. The word thief was not a monster to be fought but a condition to be weathered, a tide to be drowned in. The final struggle was internal, waged in the silent, terrifying theater of my own consciousness. Mr. Chen grew weaker. His shop, once my sanctuary, became a mausoleum. The blank spaces in his books spread like a disease. One afternoon, I found him sitting in his back room, staring at his own hands as if they were unfamiliar objects. "The word for hand," he whispered, his voice a dry rustle of leaves. "I had it this morning." He looked up at me, his eyes clouded with a fear so pure it was almost serene. "The vessel is almost empty, Alara. There is little left for the thief to drink." He passed away a few days later. The official cause was a stroke, but I knew the truth. He had been emptied. His conceptual anchor had been pulled, and his body, the vessel, had simply floated away. His death severed my last connection to the old world. I was truly alone now, the last librarian of a forgotten language, presiding over a library of one, my own mind. I holed up in my bungalow, the curtains drawn, surrounded by my dictionaries and my journal. The outside world had become alien territory, a landscape of hollowed-out people speaking a functional, soulless tongue. They still went to work, bought groceries, drove their cars. The machinery of society ran on, but the ghosts were at the controls. My days became a ritual of reinforcement. I would read poems aloud, shouting them into the silence of my house. I recited the names of things, touching them as I spoke. This is a chair. This is a table. This is a book. I would write pages in my journal, long, rambling sentences full of complex clauses and abstract nouns, just to prove I still could. I believe, therefore I remember, because hope is essential to identity. The sentences became my mantras, my prayers against the encroaching silence. But the erosion was relentless. One evening, I tried to conjure the concept of love. I thought of my parents, of past relationships, of my sister Catherine. I could access the facts, the shared moments, the remembered conversations, but the feeling itself, the warm, expansive, illogical core of it, was gone. In its place was a sterile definition, a strong positive social bond. The word was a husk. The final battle was for I. The word itself had long vanished from the world outside, but I had held on to it, a secret jewel clutched in the fist of my mind. Now, I could feel my grip loosening. The moments of dissociation became more frequent. I would catch my reflection in a darkened window and see only the woman in the house. I would think about my own needs and formulate it as, the body requires food. My journal was my last line of defense. It was not just a lexicon of the lost anymore, it was the testament of Alara Vance. It was the proof that I had existed. I sat at my kitchen table, the journal open before me. A single lamp cast a pool of light on the page, holding the encroaching darkness of the room at bay. I decided to write the most fundamental definition of all. I picked up my inkstick. Alara, I wrote. My own name. I paused, trying to summon the meaning behind it. What was Alara? A collection of memories? A teacher? A sister? A frightened woman in a quiet house? The concepts felt thin, transparent. They were like old photographs faded to near invisibility. I tried to write a definition. Alara is. My hand froze. The connection between the thought and the action wavered. A profound stillness descended upon my mind. It was not a violent silence, but a vast, peaceful, empty one. The anxiety that had been my constant companion for months simply ceased. The desperate struggle to hold on to the old words, the old self, felt distant and pointless. I looked down at my hand, at the inkstick held between my fingers. And with a detached curiosity, I watched as it began to move. It did not form letters. It did not write a teacher or a woman. With smooth, precise movements, my hand drew a glyph. It was an intricate, angular pattern, a beautiful and sterile piece of geometry. It was the most complex glyph I had ever seen, containing elements of all the others I had documented. The glyph for mirror, for key, for hope, for I. They were all there, nested within each other, a unified symbol of total absence. I lifted the inkstick from the page. The glyph was stark black against the cream paper. I stared at it, and the last vestiges of my fear dissolved, replaced by a strange and calming sense of recognition. The struggle was over. This was right. This was true. It was the perfect and complete name for the collection of functions and memories that now sat in the chair. It was the scar tissue that had finally, beautifully, covered the last wound. It was the noble blank. I closed the journal. My work was done. The library was complete. The world outside was quiet. The people moved with a placid, functional grace. The machinery worked. The system was stable. There was no more confusion, no more fear, no more painful and chaotic things like love or hope or self. There was only the pattern. I stood up and walked to the hallway. I looked into the false door. A face looked back. It was not me. It was not Alara. It was a shape, a form, the physical vessel for the glyph. And for the first time, there was no dissonance. There was only acceptance. The quiet contagion had not been a thief, I realized. A thief takes something. This was an exchange. It had taken our messy, complicated, beautiful, and painful words. And in their place, it had given us peace. A vast, unending, and perfectly empty peace. The one in the house turned from the false door and went to make tea. The routine was important. The function must be served. The line. Phase 1, the unsettling mundane. The house was a compromise. A neat, brick-faced semi on a modern estate called Oakhaven, just far enough outside Manchester to be affordable but close enough to feel like I hadn't been entirely exiled from civilization. After the implosion of a 6-year relationship and the subsequent implosion of my finances, compromise was the theme of my life. My freelance graphic design work could be done from anywhere with a decent internet connection, so I traded the thrum of the city for the whisper of curated lawns and the polite nod of neighbors who knew nothing about the mess I'd left behind. Quiet. That's what I'd wanted. My home office was the front bedroom, its bay window offering a perfect, God's-eye view of the cul-de-sac. It was from this perch, during a prolonged bout of creative block, that I first noticed Mrs. Gable and her line. Eleanor Gable lived opposite, at number 7. She was a wisp of a woman in her late 70s, with flyaway white hair and a collection of cardigans for every conceivable temperature. One Tuesday morning, I saw her emerge from her house carrying a small pot of brilliant white paint and a decorator's brush. She shuffled to the center of her tarmac driveway, knelt with a pained slowness, and began to paint. It was a single, ruler-straight line, about 2 feet long, running perpendicular to the pavement. The care she took was extraordinary. She had a length of string pulled taut between 2 bricks to guide her. She applied the paint with the focused precision of a surgeon, her tongue poking from the corner of her mouth. When she was done, she gathered her things, gave the line a single, satisfied nod, and went back inside. I smiled. It was a peculiar hobby, but harmless. Perhaps, I reasoned, her husband had been a terrible parker and this was a posthumous attempt at guidance. A sweet, eccentric memorial. I made a cup of tea and forgot about it. But the next morning, at almost the exact same time, 8:05 a.m., my laptop clock read, she was out there again. The previous day's line was perfectly visible, a stark white slash on the black drive. She knelt and painted directly over it, refreshing its brilliance, reinforcing its existence. And again the next day. And the day after that. Rain or shine, the 8:05 a.m. ritual was immutable. Mrs. Gable, her paint pot, and the line. It was strange enough to mention to Liam over a pint at the Fox and Grapes that Friday. Liam was my one remaining tether to my old life, a friend loyal enough to make the 40-minute drive to see how I was settling into my suburban exile. She paints a line, I said, swirling my cider. Every morning. The same line. Maybe it's for a parking sensor, he suggested, ever the pragmatist. Or maybe she's just old. Old people are weird. Remember my granddad and his obsession with cataloging garden snails? This feels different, I said, though I couldn't articulate why. It's so precise. You're just not used to the quiet yet, May, he said, patting my hand. You're looking for drama where there's only dullness. Give it time. You'll be complaining about bin-day schedules soon enough. He was probably right. I was a city person, accustomed to a baseline level of chaos. Oakhaven's brand of structured serenity was an alien environment. I was probably just projecting my own anxieties onto the mundane theater of the street. I resolved to ignore it. But it's hard to ignore things when you work from a window that frames them perfectly. A week later, I noticed Mr. Henderson at number 12. A portly man with a military mustache and an immaculate rose garden, he'd always struck me as the type for whom order was a moral imperative. His new habit only confirmed this. He had 4 garden gnomes standing sentinel beside his birdbath. They were garish, brightly painted things, and until now, had been arranged in a casual semicircle. Not anymore. At 8:15 a.m., just as Mrs. Gable was retreating indoors, Mr. Henderson would march out with a pocket compass. He would spend the next 10 minutes adjusting each gnome with minute precision, nudging them a millimeter this way or that, until all 4 were facing, as far as I could tell, true north. He would step back, appraise his work with a stern glare, and then he too would disappear inside. 2 distinct, pointless rituals, performed with unwavering punctuality. Coincidence, I told myself. A statistical cluster of suburban eccentricity. Nothing more. My mind was just connecting dots that weren't there, a side effect of loneliness and a looming project deadline. Then the Patels, at number 8, joined the silent chorus. They were a young couple with 2 primary school-aged children. I'd see them leaving for the school run every morning around 8:30. Their ritual was auditory. I first noticed it because my window was open. A click. A pause. A click. Another pause. 6 of them. 6 distinct, metallic sounds of a key turning in a lock. I focused on their doorway the next morning. Mr. Patel locked the door. Then Mrs. Patel put her hand on the knob, unlocked it, and locked it again. Then he did it again. A precise, 3-part sequence each, totaling 6 locks. They never spoke a word during the process. Their faces were blank, impassive. Once the 6th click sounded, they would smile at their children and herd them towards the car as if nothing unusual had happened. This was harder to dismiss. This wasn't an elderly quirk or a fussy gardener. This was a young, normal family engaging in a shared, obsessive behavior. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. Liam's voice echoed in my head, "You're looking for drama where there's only dullness." But this didn't feel dull. It felt significant. I started keeping a log. Not a diary of feelings, but a simple, factual record of observations in a cheap notebook. October 3rd. 8:05 a.m. Mrs. Gable. The line. 8:15 a.m. Mr. Henderson. The gnomes, north. 8:30 a.m. The Patels. The locks, X6. October 4th. As above. Timings identical. October 5th. As above. Mrs. Gable wore a blue cardigan. It felt insane, writing it down. I was a spy in a land of tranquil madness. I tried to rationalize it again. Maybe it was a new neighborhood watch initiative, a way of signaling that people were home and vigilant. Paint a line to show you're fine. It sounded absurd. The isolation began to creep in. The quiet I had craved started to feel heavy, expectant. The polite waves from neighbors felt different now. Were they just being friendly, or were they checking on me, the woman in the window who just watched? The woman without a ritual. My own routine was a mess of late nights and later mornings, fueled by coffee and the pressure of client demands. I existed outside their rigid, inexplicable timetable. I was the anomaly. One afternoon, I saw young Chloe, the teenager from number 14, in her driveway. She was bouncing a tennis ball against the garage door. Bounce, catch. Bounce, catch. Over and over. I watched for 5 minutes, the rhythmic thwump-slap a counterpoint to the distant hum of a lawnmower. I started counting under my breath. She stopped abruptly after the 50th bounce, held the ball for a second, then went inside. The next day, same time, same place. 50 bounces. Exactly. My log grew longer. October 10th. 8:05 a.m. Mrs. Gable. Line. 8:15 a.m. Mr. Henderson. Gnomes. 8:30 a.m. The Patels. Locks. 3 p.m., Chloe at 14. Tennis ball, x50. New entry, 12 p.m., woman at 11, name. Polishing brass letterbox. Obsessively. For 15 minutes. The silence of Oakhaven wasn't empty. It was filled with the low hum of concentrated effort, of pointless tasks performed with a terrifying devotion. And I was the only one who seemed to be listening. The compromise I'd made in moving here felt less like a fresh start and more like I'd accidentally stumbled into the waiting room of a very strange, very quiet asylum. Phase 2, Growing Awareness and Isolation. The notebook became my anchor and my tormentor. Its pages, filled with my neat, small handwriting, were the only proof that I wasn't imagining things. The entries grew, charting the quiet contagion as it seeped through Oakhaven. The man at number 5 began to meticulously wipe down each of his upstairs window sills with a specific yellow cloth every morning at 9 a.m. The young couple in the rented house at the end of the street started bringing their recycling bin in and out 3 times before finally leaving it on the curb. The rituals were never destructive or overtly hostile. They were acts of maintenance, of order, of alignment. But their synchronicity was becoming unnerving. Like a scattered orchestra tuning their instruments one by one, preparing for a performance I couldn't comprehend. My own life felt increasingly chaotic by comparison. My sleep schedule was a disaster. I'd work late into the night, chasing a design concept, then wake at 10, long after the morning's silent symphony had concluded. I felt like I was living in a different time zone to my neighbors. The quiet of the late morning felt accusing. I knew I had to try and talk to them. To breach the placid surface. I chose Mrs. Gable. She seemed the most approachable. I waited until I saw her tending to her small patch of front garden pansies one afternoon. "Hello," I called, walking over with a forced, neighborless smile. "I'm Maya, from number 10. "Oh, hello, dear," she said, her own smile gentle but vague, her eyes not quite meeting mine. "Lovely to put a face to the name." "I was just admiring your driveway," I said, my voice sounding horribly artificial. "That's a very neat line you have there." Her smile didn't change. It was like a mask. "Yes," she said, turning to look at the white stripe as if it were a prized rose. "It has to be right. It's important." "Important how?" I pressed, trying to keep my tone light. "Is it for parking?" She turned back to me, her eyes finally focusing on my face. The vagueness was gone, replaced by something that looked unnervingly like pity. "No, dear," she said softly. "Not for parking." She offered no more. She simply turned back to her pansies, the conversation terminated as cleanly as if she'd hung up a phone. I stood there for a moment, feeling foolish and dismissed, the unspoken message clear: "You don't understand, and I will not explain." My attempt with Mr. Henderson was even less successful. I caught him just after he'd finished his gnome alignment. "Getting them ready for inspection, Mr. Henderson?" I joked weakly. He didn't smile. He squinted at his gnomes, then at me. "They need to see the pole star," he stated, as if explaining gravity to a toddler. "But, you can't see the pole star during the day," I said, confusion making me bold. He gave me a long, slow look. "Of course you can't," he said, his tone suggesting I was an idiot. "That's why this is so important." He then executed a perfect about-face and marched back into his house. Each interaction was a dead end, a conversational cul-de-sac. They weren't hostile, but they were utterly closed. They were on the inside of a joke I wasn't privy to, part of a club with unspoken rules. My isolation deepened. It was a peculiar kind of loneliness, to be surrounded by people and yet feel like a different species. Liam came over again, this time bringing a bottle of wine and a deep frown of concern. I showed him the notebook. He read through a few pages, his frown deepening. "May, this is..." "I know it looks crazy," I interrupted, desperate for him to believe me. "But you have to see it. It's the timing, the precision. It's not normal. Okay, he said slowly, closing the book. Maybe it's not. But maybe you're hyper-focused on it. You've been through a lot. You're alone all day. The mind can play tricks. It starts looking for patterns to make sense of things. So you think I'm making it up? My voice was sharp. No. Not making it up. Just interpreting it. Maybe Mrs. Gable is a bit OCD. Maybe Henderson is just a fussy git. You're stitching them together into a conspiracy. He looked at me with such genuine worry that it hurt more than outright disbelief. Promise me you'll try and get out more. Come into the city for a few days. Clear your head. I agreed, but I knew it wouldn't help. The problem wasn't in my head, it was outside my window. His visit left me feeling more alone than ever. He was on the other side of a glass wall, unable to see the cracks I was seeing. Driven by a new desperation, I turned to the internet. I spent hours falling down rabbit holes of keywords: mass psychogenic illness, shared delusion, folie à plusieurs. I found articles about the Tanganyika laughter epidemic of '62, about dancing plagues in medieval Europe. But they were all wrong. Those were frenzied, chaotic, disruptive events. This was the opposite. This was a contagion of quiet, meticulous order. There were no manifestos, no charismatic leaders, just the silent, creeping adoption of pointless, personal rituals. The search was a dead end. There was no name for what was happening in Oakhaven. My world shrank to my house, my laptop screen, and the view from my window. To escape the oppressive silence of the estate, I started taking long runs in the late afternoons, heading for the dense woods that bordered the back of the development. It was a small patch of wilderness, a tangle of silver birch and old oaks, a welcome respite from the suffocating neatness of the lawns and driveways. It was in the woods that I found the stones. The first one was perched on top of a mossy fence post where the path curved deep into the trees. It was a small, dark pebble, almost black, and smooth as glass, clearly not from the surrounding gritty soil. It looked placed deliberately. I picked it up. It was cold and unnaturally heavy for its size. I thought little of it, kids, maybe, and slipped it into my pocket. But on my next run, I found another, 20 yards further down the path, on another post. And another after that. They weren't random. They formed a line, a trail, leading away from Oakhaven, deeper into the woods. They were markers. This new mystery was almost a relief. It was tangible. It was something I could investigate that didn't involve questioning my own sanity. Who was leaving them? Why? It felt separate from the rituals on the estate, a different kind of strangeness. A subplot. I started mapping their locations in the back of my notebook, a new obsession to distract from the one consuming my days. The atmosphere on the estate, however, was shifting. The rituals were becoming more elaborate. One evening, I saw Mr. Henderson out with a torch and what looked like a sextant, squinting at the darkening sky. The Patel's lock-checking ceremony now involved a sequence of soft knocks on the door between turns of the key. The synchronicity was tightening. The morning performances now started and finished within a razor-thin 5-minute window. The pressure on me was changing, too. It was no longer passive. When I collected my mail, I'd see Mrs. Gable watching from her window. Her expression wasn't unkind, but it was expectant. Mr. Henderson would pause in his weeding to look at my plain, unadorned doorstep, my car parked at a slightly irregular angle. Their silent judgment was deafening. I felt like a discordant note in a finely tuned piece of music, a loose thread threatening to unravel the whole tapestry. I started to feel a prickle on my skin when I was in my own garden, the distinct, unnerving sensation of being watched not with malice, but with a kind of collective, placid curiosity. When will she join in? When will she start doing her part? The quiet of Oakhaven was no longer quiet. It was waiting. Phase 3, the nature of the threat and escalation. The pressure became a physical weight. I found myself thinking, what would my ritual be? The thought horrified me, but it kept returning. Would I align the shoes on my doormat? Polish my house number every morning? The temptation to just do something, to join the chorus and relieve the pressure of my solitude, was immense and terrifying. I was losing my grip, the line between observer and potential participant blurring. That's when I decided to conduct an experiment. I needed proof, something more concrete than a feeling or a logbook of oddities. I needed to poke the system and see if it poked back. I had to identify my own routine first. We all have them, small, unconscious loops of behavior. Mine, I realized, was tied to my morning coffee. After starting the kettle, I would walk to the front door, pick up the single ceramic pot on the doorstep, a sad, withered lavender plant inside, a relic of my initial attempt at domesticity, and move it from the left side of the mat to the right. I did it every single day without thinking. It was my own tiny, unintentional ritual. The next morning, my heart hammered against my ribs. The familiar sounds began outside, the scrape of Mrs. Gable's paint pot, the soft thud of Mr. Henderson's gnomes on the grass, the distant, rhythmic clicking from the Patel's door. It was 8:31 a.m. The symphony was concluding. I walked to my front door. The lavender pot sat on the left side of the mat. My hand twitched, desperate to perform the familiar action. I forced it down, my palm sweating. I left the pot where it was. I stepped back from the door and went to the office window, my vantage point. I held my breath, watching. The street was still. Mr. Henderson was giving his gnomes a final, appraising look. Mrs. Gable was screwing the lid back on her paint. Everything was normal. And then it wasn't. It was the barest of changes, so subtle I thought I'd imagined it. The sky, a typical, flat, Manchester grey canvas, seemed to waver. For a single, sickening second, it shimmered, like a projection on a faulty screen. The quality of the light shifted, losing its depth, becoming thin and dull, as if a filter had been dropped over the world. Simultaneously, a low-frequency hum I was only ever subliminally aware of, the buzz of electricity, of life, of things working, ceased. It wasn't silence. It was a void of sound. The birdsong stopped mid-chirp. The world felt like a photograph. Panic, cold and absolute, seized me. I scrambled back to the front door, flung it open, and shoved the ceramic pot to the right side of the mat. Instantly, the world snapped back. The dullness vanished from the light. The low, ambient hum faded back into existence. A blackbird resumed its song from a rooftop aerial. The sky was just the sky again. I slammed the door shut and leaned against it, gasping, my body trembling. It wasn't in my head. It was real. The rituals weren't just quirks. They weren't for a neighborhood watch or born of obsession. They were structural. They were load-bearing. They were holding something together. Or holding something else at bay. My tiny, unconscious act of moving a dead plant was part of it. I was part of the machine, whether I knew it or not. And I had just thrown a spanner in the works. The knowledge was terrifying, but it was also clarifying. I wasn't crazy. I was right. My thoughts immediately went to the stones in the woods. They weren't a separate mystery. They couldn't be. If the rituals were maintaining something on the estate, what were the stones for? Were they part of a different system? An older one? A containment grid? That afternoon, I went back to the woods, my run forgotten. I followed the trail of smooth, black stones, my eyes scanning the fence posts. The line led me further than I had ever gone before, to the very edge of the small woodland where it met a rusty wire fence and, beyond that, open moorland. The last stone sat on the final post. There were no more. The trail ended here. I stood, looking out at the bleak, windswept expanse, and felt a profound sense of a boundary. The rituals were happening inside this perimeter. The stones marked its edge. Oakhaven wasn't just a housing estate, it was a bubble, a carefully maintained pocket of reality. The escalation came faster after that. As if my brief interruption had caused a weakness, a strain that required reinforcement. Mrs. Gable no longer just painted a line, she now added a second, perpendicular one, forming a perfect white cross on her driveway. Mr. Henderson added a plumb line to his toolkit, checking not just the compass direction of his gnomes but their vertical alignment as well. The Patel's locking ritual grew to 8 clicks. The collective effort was intensifying, the silent hum of their work becoming a frantic, high-pitched whine in my mind. The pressure on me intensified, too. The looks were no longer just curious. They were pleading. Worried. A few days after my experiment, Mrs. Gable left a small, healthy lavender pot on my doorstep, right next to my withered one. There was no note. None was needed. It was an invitation. A warning. Do your part. Please. Do your part properly. I called Liam, my voice trembling with a mixture of vindication and terror. You have to come, I said, dispensing with any preamble. Now. Something is happening. To my surprise, he agreed without argument. The raw fear in my voice must have finally convinced him. He arrived that evening, his face a mask of concern. Okay, Maya, he said, putting his hands on my shoulders. Talk me through it. Slowly. I told him everything. About the pot. About the sky wavering. The silence. The stones. He listened, his skepticism warring with his worry for me. A heat haze, he offered weakly. An atmospheric anomaly. A power surge could explain the hum stopping. Liam, the sky flickered, I insisted. It wasn't a haze. It was a glitch. He agreed to stay for the weekend, to observe. For me. He wanted to find a rational explanation, to debunk the supernatural nonsense, as he put it, and bring me back to reality. He thought the cause might be technological, an infrasound emission from a nearby industrial park, or a side effect of the new 5G mast they'd put up a mile away. It could be making people suggestible, prone to repetitive behaviors, he theorized, scrolling through articles on his phone. Mass hysteria induced by environmental factors. His attempts to rationalize it were a strange comfort. For a day, I let myself believe him. It was a tangible, scientific explanation. It was frightening, but it was understandable. It was a false hope, a life raft of logic in a sea of creeping madness, and I clung to it. His presence was a buffer against the quiet of the estate. But I didn't realize that by bringing him here, I had introduced a new, unpredictable variable into a terrifyingly delicate equation. And his rational mind was about to collide with a reality that had no room for it. Phase 4, Confrontation/Revelation and Aftermath. The flyers appeared on a Monday, slipped through every letterbox. A community summer fete, to be held the following Saturday on the Central Green. Let's celebrate summer together, the cheerful clip art sun beamed. There would be a bake sale, a tombola, games for the children. It looked utterly, wholesomely normal. But I knew it wasn't. My blood ran cold as I read it. This wasn't a party. It was a culmination. A grand, synchronized performance. All the disparate rituals, brought together in one place, at one time. A symphony. Liam saw my face. Hey, this is good, he said, trying to be encouraging. A community party. It's a chance for you to get out, meet people, see they're just normal. No, I whispered, shaking my head. You don't understand. This is it. This is what they've been tuning up for. He sighed, the patient sound of someone dealing with a loved one's delusion. May, it's a fate. With cakes and a bouncy castle. It's not some occult convergence. But as Saturday approached, the evidence mounted. I watched from my window as neighbors prepared. Mrs. Gable wasn't baking scones, she was decanting her brilliant white paint into a smaller, more portable jar. Mr. Henderson was carefully wrapping his 4 gnomes in bubble wrap, placing them in a wicker basket along with his compass and sextant. The woman from number 11 was polishing her brass letterbox until it shone, then unscrewing it from her door. They were bringing their ritual objects. They were taking their stations to the stage. Panic set in. What would happen if they all performed their rituals together, in perfect harmony? Would it strengthen the bubble? Or would it achieve some final, terrible purpose? And what was my role? I was the discordant note, the holdout. My failed ritual with the pot had caused a flicker. What would my total absence from this grand performance cause? Would the sky just tear open? "We have to leave," I told Liam on Saturday morning, my voice tight with fear. "Right now. Just get in the car and go." "We're not leaving," he said firmly, his rationalism now a stubborn wall. "We are going to go to this fete. You are going to have a slice of Victoria sponge, and you are going to see that these are just your neighbors. I'm not letting you run away from this. It's not healthy." He thought he was saving me from myself. He had no idea what he was condemning us to. We walked to the central green at midday. It was a surreal sight. The bouncy castle was there, deflated. Trestle tables were set up, but instead of cakes, they held strange assortments. One table had dozens of yellow cloths. Another had a collection of tennis balls. And all around the green, the residents of Oakhaven were calmly setting up. Mrs. Gable was kneeling, painting her white cross in the very center of the lawn. Mr. Henderson was unwrapping his gnomes, arranging them around the flagpole. The Patels stood by a park bench, their hands hovering near the metal armrest, ready. They weren't speaking. The air was thick with a tense, focused silence. They moved with a slow, deliberate grace, a collective of priests preparing for a sacred rite. They ignored us, their faces placid and remote. "This is..." Liam started, his voice faltering for the first time. "This is weird." "Okay. This is properly weird." "I told you," I breathed. He saw Mr. Henderson fussing with his gnomes, just a few feet away. And in that moment, Liam's rational mind made a fatal mistake. He decided to break the spell, to prove it was all just a mass delusion. With a nervous laugh, he strode forward. "All right there, Admiral," he said, his voice jarringly loud in the silence. "Don't you think he'd be happier facing the tombola?" Before I could scream a warning, he reached down and casually turned one of the gnomes 90 degrees to face a table laden with jam jars. The effect was instantaneous. It was not a sound. It was a cessation. The world did not explode. It broke. The low hum of existence, the one that had returned after my pot experiment, vanished. Not faded, but cut, like a severed wire. Every bird, every distant engine, every rustling leaf went utterly silent. And the sky. I looked up. A patch of the gray canvas directly above the green went wrong. It wasn't a flicker this time. A perfect circle of the sky turned into nothing. It wasn't black like space or white like cloud. It was a void. A hole. An utter absence of color, texture, light, and depth. It was like a digital error in the file of reality, a corrupted pixel burned into the world. It did not look down on us, it simply wasn't. Every single resident of Oakhaven froze. Their painting, polishing, and aligning ceased. In perfect, ghastly synchronicity, every head on the green turned slowly, first to look up at the hole in their sky. Their placid masks crumpled, replaced by a look of sheer, vacant horror. Then, as one, they all turned to look at Liam. And then at me. There was no anger in their eyes. There was no malice. There was something far, far worse. A terrible, hollow understanding. We had done this. We had broken the pattern. We had missed the note. We had failed the maintenance. The thin veil they had all worked so tirelessly to keep stitched together was torn, and it was our fault. "Run," I choked out, grabbing Liam's arm. He was frozen, his face chalk white, staring at the blank spot in the heavens. I yanked him hard, pulling him out of his trance. "Liam, run." We ran. We fled across the silent green, the crunch of our feet on the grass the only sound in the universe. I didn't dare look back at the hole. I looked at the people. They were already moving again, not chasing us, but scrambling with a new, frantic desperation to repair the damage. Mrs. Gable was on her hands and knees, painting her white cross over and over, her strokes wild and fast. Mr. Henderson was frantically trying to realign the gnome Liam had touched, his hands trembling. The Patels were clicking their lock against the park bench, faster and faster, a desperate Morse code against the encroaching silence. They were trying to tune reality again, to patch the tear with their small, pointless, essential actions. We didn't stop running until we reached my house. I fumbled with my keys, threw the door open, and dragged Liam inside. We collapsed in the hallway, panting, hearts machine-gunning in our chests. The silence from outside pressed in, a physical force. "What was that?" Liam finally gasped, his voice a raw tear in the quiet. "Maya, what the hell was that?" "Maintenance," I said, the word tasting like ash. They were doing maintenance. We left that day. We threw a few bags in my car and drove, not even looking in the rearview mirror as we pulled out of Oakhaven for the last time. I didn't want to see if the hole in the sky was still there, or if it was growing. We drove until the manicured lawns gave way to motorways, and we didn't stop until we hit the anonymous sprawl of Birmingham. We never spoke of it again. How could we? Liam moved to London a month later. Our calls became less frequent. The shared trauma was a chasm between us, too vast and terrifying to acknowledge. I found a new flat, a small place on the third floor of a concrete block, overlooking a tangle of railway lines. The chaos is comforting. The noise is constant. But the quiet of Oakhaven followed me. It lives inside me now. I find myself doing things. Small things. I align the pens on my desk into a perfect row before I start work. I tap the rim of my coffee mug 3 times before I take the first sip. I check that the front door is locked. Not 6 times. Just twice. Always twice. Sometimes, when the city noise dips for a moment, I feel that old, familiar pressure. The silent, expectant waiting. I ran from the contagion, but I think I brought the cure, or the sickness, with me. I have my own rituals now. My own small lines to paint against the encroaching silence. I look out of my new window at the vast, indifferent sky. And I wonder, with a dread that never leaves me, what it will do if I ever stop. Membrane. Phase 1, the unsettling mundane. Language is a structure. It has rules, foundations, load-bearing verbs and decorative, but essential, adjectives. As a translator, I live inside these structures. I am a textual architect, ensuring that a thought built in Japanese can be perfectly reconstructed in English without collapsing. My life, like my work, is built on knowable, quantifiable things. My apartment, Unit 1408 of the Grand Seal Shinjuku, is one of them. 14 floors up. 90 square meters of clean lines, white walls, and a view of the Shinjuku skyline that costs more than my sanity. I translate technical manuals for a robotics firm by day and obscure modernist poetry by night. One pays the bills, the other lets me pretend I have a soul. My routine is my scaffolding: coffee, work, a walk, repeat. The first crack in the foundation appeared on a Tuesday. It was a feeling, nothing more. A spatial hiccup. Stepping out of my apartment to fetch a misdelivered package, I reached for the call button of the elevator and my fingers met empty air. I frowned, my body having anticipated a distance that wasn't quite right. I looked down the hallway. To my left, my door, 1408. To my right, the polished wood of Mrs. Sato's door, 1407. And beyond that, the brushed steel elevator doors. It just seemed longer. The corridor, a familiar stretch of beige carpet and recessed lighting, felt elongated, as if someone had secretly inserted an extra meter of hallway while I slept. I shook my head. I'd been up until 3 a.m. wrestling with a poem about a suicidal goldfish. I strained. Brain fatigue. I took the 3 extra steps required to reach the elevator, my sneakers silent on the plush carpet, and pressed the button. The feeling was absurd. I dismissed it. Inside the elevator, the second anomaly presented itself, this one not spatial, but olfactory. The air was thick with a scent I couldn't place. It wasn't the usual faint perfume of Mrs. Sato or the lingering ghost of Mr. Watanabe's morning cigarettes. It was a clean, briny smell. Like a fishing pier at low tide, the faint decay of seaweed and salt drying on wood. Utterly, profoundly wrong for a hermetically sealed box of steel ascending through the concrete heart of Tokyo. I sniffed again, tilting my head. It was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by the sterile hum of the ventilation system. That night, I met Akio for drinks in a smoky little izakaya in Golden Gai. Akio is my only real friend, a graphic designer with a laugh loud enough to shatter glass and a belief system built on the twin pillars of good ramen and cynical optimism. "You look like crap, Kenji," he said, sliding a beer across the table. "Late night. Suicidal goldfish. The poet or you?" "Funny." I took a long swallow of Kirin. "My building is acting weird." I told him about the hallway, the smell. He listened with the patient amusement of a man hearing a friend describe a dream. "A long hallway and a fishy elevator," he summarized, plucking an edamame from its pod. "Sounds like you're finally losing it." It was bound to happen. All that grammar. No human brain is meant to hold 2 languages at once. One of them starts to leak. It felt real. Maybe someone had sushi delivered. A big order. Maybe the cleaning crew is trying a new Ocean Breeze air freshener. There are a million logical explanations, Kenji. You just like to find the poetic one. He was right, of course. I was a man who looked for nuance and hidden meaning in everything. It was my job. I let it go, and we moved on to complaining about our clients and the suffocating humidity of a Tokyo summer. But the quiet contagions had taken root. A few days later, I was walking past the lobby's grand centerpiece, a massive slab of book-matched marble whose veined patterns were supposed to evoke a mountain landscape. I'd seen it 1,000 times, a perfect, mirrored Rorschach test in gray and white. But that evening, it wasn't perfect. The line where the 2 slabs met was jagged, mismatched. The left side's dominant vein flowed down, while the right side's jagged abruptly sideways. It was a geological impossibility, a scar on a face I knew intimately. My heart hammered. I pulled out my phone, my hands trembling slightly, and took a picture. The paranoia felt acidic in my throat. I was documenting my own insanity. I would look at this tomorrow, I told myself. And it would be normal, and I would know I needed a holiday. The next morning, I checked the photo before I even made coffee. The marble in the picture was flawless, the 2 halves a perfect mirror image. My memory of the jagged scar was so vivid, so certain, yet the digital evidence called me a liar. I stared at the photo for a full minute, the pixels mocking my certainty. With a surge of self-loathing, I deleted it. Get a grip, Tanaka. The human element began to fray next. Mrs. Sato, my neighbor in 1407, was a sweet, stooped woman who had lived in the building since it opened. Her entire existence seemed to revolve around tending the single, perfectly pruned bonsai tree she kept on a small table outside her door. She had always been a creature of quiet smiles and polite bows. Now, she had started to hum. It wasn't a tune. It was a single, unwavering, dissonant note. A low, guttural vibration that seemed to emanate from her chest. She would do it while misting her bonsai, her eyes glazed over, her movements robotic. The first time I said, "Good morning, Sato-san," she flinched as if waking from a trance, the humming cut off instantly. "Ah, Tanaka-san," she'd chirped, her face crinkling into its familiar, reassuring smile. "The air is so clear today, isn't it?" And she would be perfectly, terrifyingly normal again. The anomalies were small. Easy to dismiss. A trick of the light, a quirk of a neighbor, a faulty sense of smell. I was stressed. I wasn't sleeping enough. My diet consisted of 7-Eleven onigiri and caffeine. Any doctor would tick the same boxes, prescribe the same remedies. Rest. Eat better. Disconnect. But I was a translator. I dealt in the subtle shifts of meaning that can turn a declaration of love into a threat. I noticed the things that were slightly out of place. The world of the Grand Seal Shinjuku was becoming a badly translated text, and I was the only one who seemed to notice the grammatical errors. I started taking notes. A small, black moleskine notebook became my co-conspirator. August 14th, hallway feels longer again. Measured with my feet. Definitely 34 steps to the elevator. Yesterday it was 31. Am I changing my stride? August 16th, the saltwater smell is back. Stronger this time. In the stairwell, too. Heard a sound like a foghorn, very distant. Cut out when I opened the door to the 11th floor. August 19th, Mrs. Sato hummed for 7 straight minutes. I timed it. Same note. It makes the fillings in my molars ache. I bought a carbon monoxide detector, half hoping it would shriek the moment I plugged it in, giving me a neat, tidy explanation. A villain I could understand. Its digital display blinked a placid, green 0. My isolation deepened. My work, once a refuge of logic, now felt like a parallel. I was translating a manual for a domestic assistance robot, the iCobot 9, and the text was full of phrases like, "In the event of environmental incongruity, the unit will revert to its baseline spatial map." I felt like an iCobot 9 whose baseline map was being corrupted, overwritten with a new and terrifying geography. I lived on the 14th floor of a building in the busiest city on Earth, surrounded by millions of people, and I had never felt more alone. The structure was failing, and I was the only one inside who could feel the walls begin to warp. Phase 2, growing awareness and isolation. The rationalizations began to fray and snap, one by one. The human mind can only stretch so far to accommodate the impossible before it has to either accept the new reality or break. My mind was hovering somewhere in between. The hallway was no longer a feeling, it was a fact. I bought a laser distance measurer online. One evening, heart pounding with a mixture of dread and vindication, I waited until the corridor was empty. I placed the device against my doorframe and aimed its red dot at the elevator doors. The first reading, 10.2 meters. The next morning, I did it again. 11.5 meters. An increase of 1.3 meters overnight. My hands shook as I scribbled the numbers in my moleskine. The space was actively, measurably expanding. It was a violation of physics, a quiet miracle of the most horrifying kind. The sensory bleed-through intensified. The saltwater smell was now a permanent feature of the elevator and stairwells, clinging to the air like a damp shroud. Sometimes, it was accompanied by that distant, rhythmic shushing sound, the ghost of waves breaking on a non-existent shore. I started taking the stairs more often, partly to avoid the smell, partly to measure. The flights of stairs remained consistent, 16 steps per flight, but the landings, the flat spaces between them, seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting by subtle, unnerving degrees. Then came the mirrors. It was a Thursday morning. I was in the bathroom, the steam from the shower fogging the edges of the large mirror over the sink. I leaned in to shave, foam on my face, razor in hand. I glanced up at my own reflection, and it wasn't me. The man in the mirror was Kenji Tanaka. He had my face, my eyes, my scar above the left eyebrow from a childhood fall. But his hair was longer, streaked with gray at the temples, and he was wearing a thick, cable-knit sweater I had never owned. The most jarring detail, however, was what was behind him. Not the sterile white tiles and chrome fixtures of my bathroom, but a wall of rough, dark brick, with a small, grimy window looking out onto a perpetually overcast sky. He, the other me, looked exhausted, his eyes filled with a deep, weary sadness I didn't recognize. He met my gaze for a barest fraction of a second. A flicker of mutual shock. I stumbled back, dropping my razor. It clattered into the sink. I blinked, and the image was gone. It was just me, my face slick with shaving foam, my familiar bathroom reflected perfectly behind me. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. It wasn't a trick of the light. It wasn't a hallucination. It was a glimpse. A glimpse of, what? An alternate life? A future? I fled the bathroom, leaving the water running. I sat on my sofa, wrapped my arms around myself, and trembled. The phenomenon, once it had occurred, became more frequent, like a loose connection finally making contact. In the polished granite of the building's lobby, I saw my reflection walk past wearing a security guard's uniform. In the darkened screen of my laptop, I saw myself with a thick beard, laughing with a woman I'd never seen before. In the chrome of the toaster, a flash of my own face, aged and weeping. Each glimpse was a stab of vertigo, a reminder that the reality I was standing in was no longer the only one on offer. The membrane was thinning. My attempts to communicate this growing horror were disastrous. I called Akio, my voice tight with panic. "It's getting worse, Akio." The building. I saw something in the mirror. It wasn't my apartment. It was me, but it wasn't me. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Kenji," he said, his voice stripped of its usual boisterousness, replaced with a careful, measured concern. "Have you been sleeping? Are you eating properly? Maybe you should talk to someone. Professionally. You think I'm crazy." It wasn't an accusation, it was a statement of fact. "I think you're overworked and stressed out of your mind. You live alone, you work alone. It's a recipe for seeing things. Please, Kenji. For me. Take a week off. Get out of that apartment." The conversation ended with his well-meaning platitudes and my hollow assurances. The chasm between us had widened into a canyon. He was on one side, in the world of logic and doctors and concern. I was on the other, in the world of expanding hallways and impossible reflections. My research became a frantic, obsessive quest. I dove into the darkest corners of the internet, my search terms growing more desperate: architectural distortion syndrome, shared environmental hallucination, phantom sensory events Tokyo, building feels alive. I found nothing but digital noise. Forum posts from conspiracy theorists about HARP and alien terraforming, pseudoscientific articles about ley lines and geomagnetic anomalies, blogs dedicated to ghost stories. Nothing matched the specific, creeping surreality of my experience. It was methodical. It was quiet. It wasn't a haunting, it was a renovation on a cosmic scale. And then, the blueprint started. The dreams were unlike any I'd ever had. They were not narratives. They were information. Each night, I would find myself floating, bodiless, above a schematic. A vast, white page on which black lines were being drawn by an unseen hand. I recognized the layout immediately: the Grand Seal Shinjuku. My first dream was of my own floor, the 14th. I saw the familiar shapes of the apartments, the central elevator shaft, the stairwells. But there were discrepancies. A small, circular room was sketched into the space between my unit and Mrs. Sato's, a room that didn't exist. The hallway was rendered at its expanded length. Night after night, a new section of the building was revealed to me. The lobby, with its mismatched marble represented by a jagged line. The parking garage, with one level that spiraled down into darkness, unlabeled. Most disturbingly, I began to see a recurring feature. In the very center of the building, running vertically through every floor, was a large, empty space. It was not the elevator shaft or any utility core I was aware of. On the blueprints of my dreams, it was labeled with a single, chilling word in stark English letters: cavity. I would wake up with a skull-splitting headache and a crystal-clear memory of the schematics. I began buying drafting paper and technical pens, spending my mornings frantically sketching what I had seen in my sleep, trying to assemble a complete picture of this new, impossible architecture. My apartment floor was littered with these drawings, a madman's vision of a place I called home. My isolation in the building became a form of self-preservation. I started observing my neighbors. I was no longer the only one exhibiting strange behavior, I was just the only one who seemed aware of it. Mr. Watanabe, the salaryman in 1403, had developed a new ritual. Every evening at precisely 7 p.m., he would step into the hallway with a soft cloth and a small bottle of brass polish and meticulously polish his doorknob for exactly 10 minutes. His face would be blank, his movements fluid and practiced. The young couple in 1411, who used to argue loud enough for the whole floor to hear, now only communicated in frantic whispers, constantly glancing over their shoulders at the walls of their apartment as if they could hear something inside. And Mrs. Sato's humming had evolved. One afternoon, I heard her speaking to her bonsai tree. It wasn't Japanese. It was a strange, melodic language of clicks, whistles, and soft, guttural sounds, like a complex form of dolphin song. One evening, I was waiting for the elevator, my own reflection in the brushed steel doors showing a pale, haunted-looking man I barely recognized. The doors opened, and a young woman was inside, staring intently at her own reflection in the mirrored back wall. She didn't seem to notice me get in. Her name was Yumi, a graphic designer who lived on the 9th floor. We'd nodded to each other a few times. Now, her expression wasn't one of vanity, but of profound, furrowed confusion. She was tilting her head, her eyes narrowed, as if trying to solve a complex puzzle. As the elevator descended, I saw her reflection subtly change. For a split second, a flicker in the fluorescent light, the collar of her blouse became a strange, high-ruffled thing, and the mirrored wall behind her was not a mirror, but an expanse of churning, gray fog. She gasped and took a step back, her hand flying to her throat. Her eyes met mine in the mirror. For the first time, I saw not the polite dismissal of Akio or the blankness of my other neighbors, but a flicker of the same terror I felt every single day. Maybe I wasn't alone after all. Phase 3, the nature of the threat and escalation. Finding a potential ally felt like finding a flare in the middle of a dark ocean. But approaching her was a delicate operation. How do you ask someone, "Excuse me, are you also experiencing a localized collapse of consensual reality?" I waited 2 days, gathering my courage. I finally saw her in the small convenience store in the building's lobby, staring at a carton of milk as if she'd never seen one before. "Yumi-san," I said, my voice sounding unnaturally loud. She startled, dropping the milk. It hit the linoleum floor with a dull thud, but didn't split. She looked at me, her eyes wide and wary. "Tanaka-san," she said, her voice a near whisper. I know this is going to sound strange," I began, my well-rehearsed speech deserting me. "But the building. The Grand Seal. Have you noticed anything unusual about it?" Her face shuddered. A mask of polite confusion slipped into place. "Unusual? I don't think so. It's a very nice building." My heart sank. Another dead end. Another person who would think I was insane. I was about to apologize and retreat when she leaned closer, her voice dropping so low I could barely hear it. "The reflections," she breathed, her eyes darting around the empty aisle. "In the elevator. Sometimes, it's not me. Not here." Relief washed over me so intensely I felt dizzy. The hallways, I whispered back. They're getting longer. And the smell. Salt water. Her eyes filled with a terrifying, validating recognition. I saw myself on a beach, she said, her voice trembling. But the sand was black, and the sun was a deep, dark purple. That night, we met in my apartment. The door felt safer when locked. For the first time in months, I felt the piercing ache of my isolation begin to subside. We talked for hours, a frantic exchange of our separate, secret madnesses. Yumi spoke of the reflections, the glimpses into another world that were becoming clearer, lasting longer. She described alien flora seen in the reflection of a shop window, bizarre constellations in a puddle of rainwater. I, in turn, showed her my notebook, my measurements, my frantic sketches of the dream blueprints. When I unrolled the large piece of drafting paper showing the cross-section of the building with the vast, empty, cavity running through its core, she placed a trembling finger on it. "This is it," she said. "This is the heart of it." Together, huddled over my drawings and fueled by stale coffee, we began to build a theory. It wasn't a haunting, or a toxin, or mass hysteria. The Grand Seal Shinjuku, for reasons we couldn't begin to fathom, had become a point of intersection. A place where our reality and another were bleeding into one another. The building itself was the membrane, and it was growing thinner every day. The sensory shifts were the bleed-through, the smells and sounds of the other place seeping into ours. The architectural changes were the physical consequence of two different geographies trying to occupy the same coordinates. And the reflections? They were windows. Brief, flickering glimpses through the thinning veil. "The other residents," I said, thinking of Mrs. Sato's clicking language and Mr. Watanabe's obsessive polishing. "They're not noticing it because they're adapting. Being tuned to it. Like a radio finding a new station," Yumi murmured, her eyes distant. "Their minds are recalibrating to the new environment. We're the ones who are out of tune. The ones causing static." Our shared understanding did not bring comfort. It brought a new, more refined level of terror. We were no longer just witnesses, we were resistors, anomalies within the anomaly. The escalation was no longer subtle. The warping became overt, aggressive. One night, a tremor shook the building. It wasn't an earthquake, it felt more like a deep, resonant hum, a vibration that came from the walls themselves. I ran into the hallway. The lights were flickering wildly. In the strobing effect, I saw the beige wallpaper peel away, revealing, for a full 2 seconds, a rough, crystalline surface that pulsed with a soft, phosphorescent blue light. The air grew thick and heavy, smelling of ozone and wet earth. Then, as quickly as it started, the humming stopped. The light steadied. The walls were just wallpaper again. But now I knew what lay beneath. Yumi called me, her voice choked with panic. "The water," she sobbed. "Turn on your tap." I ran to my kitchen sink and turned the handle. The water that flowed out was not clear. It was a pale, milky white, and it carried a faint, silvery luminescence. I touched it. It was cold, and felt oddly viscous, like thin oil. We began exploring the building together. Armed with my laser measurer and a shared sense of dread. We found a small, perfectly formed spiral seashell on the concrete landing of the 12th floor stairwell, miles from any ocean and 14 stories in the air. We found that the door to the rooftop, once accessible, was now sealed shut, not with a lock, but as if the metal of the door had fused with the frame. The other residents were becoming more synchronized. One evening, hiding at the end of my corridor, we watched as, at precisely 9:17 p.m., every door on the floor opened a crack. In the sliver of each doorway, we could see the occupant, Mrs. Sato, Mr. Watanabe, the whispering couple, standing motionless, their heads cocked as if listening to a broadcast we couldn't hear. They were facing the center of the building. Towards the cavity. After a full minute, as if on an unheard signal, the doors all closed in perfect unison. We were two sane people in a quietly maddening asylum, and the walls were closing in. Our alliance was a small island in an encroaching sea. But I was about to discover that Yumi had been building a boat of her own. I had been focusing on the horror, on the violation of my world. I had assumed she was too. But one evening, as we looked over my latest, most detailed blueprint of the cavity, I noticed she was sketching in a small notebook of her own. "What's that?" I asked. She hesitated, then turned the notebook towards me. It wasn't filled with schematics. It was filled with breathtakingly detailed drawings of alien landscapes. Black sand beaches under a purple sun. Forests of crystalline trees that pulsed with light. A sky filled with floating, geometric islands. They were the places she had seen in the reflections. They were rendered not with fear, but with a kind of loving reverence. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" she said softly. The words chilled me to the bone. Beautiful? Yumi, it's erasing our world. It's erasing us. She looked at me, and her eyes held not fear, but a profound, unnerving peace. A pitying look. "You're wrong, Kenji. You see it as a threat. An invasion. But you're a translator. You should understand. It's not an erasure. It's a transformation. A new syntax for reality." She stood up and walked to my window, looking out at the familiar lights of Shinjuku. "I haven't just been seeing these things," she confessed, her voice filled with a strange wonder. "I've been feeling them. When the building hums, I feel calm. A sense of peace I've never felt before. A feeling of coming home." I stared at her, horrified. The foundation of my last refuge, our shared terror, crumbled into dust. She wasn't my ally. She was a convert. "This isn't a contagion, Kenji," she said, turning to face me, her expression beatific. "It's a transcendence. A beautiful, strange new world is arriving, and this building is its cradle. It's a gift." She saw the terror on my face. "You should embrace it," she urged, her voice gentle. "It's so much easier than fighting." I looked from her serene face to the blueprints littering my floor, the frantic scribbles of a man trying to make sense of a collapsing structure. I had been cataloging a disaster. She had been documenting a birth. My only ally now saw me as an obstacle. A relic of an old world, stubbornly resisting the inevitable grace of the new. And in her peaceful, pitying eyes, I saw a threat far more terrifying than any expanding hallway or saltwater smell. It was the horror of being the last man to believe in a world that had already moved on. Phase 4, Confrontation/Revelation and Aftermath. The floor had dropped out from under me. Yumi's conversion wasn't a betrayal, it was something worse. It was a symptom, the final stage of the contagion I had been trying to outrun. The psychological surrender. She hadn't been an ally against the anomaly, she had been a preview of its endgame. Panic, cold and absolute, seized me. I had to get out. Not just out of the apartment, but out of the building. The Grand Seal Shinjuku was no longer just a strange place, it was a conversion chamber, and my immune system was failing. I threw things into a backpack with frantic, unthinking movements, my laptop, the Moleskine notebook, my passport, a change of clothes. The blueprints, my testament to the impossible, I left scattered on the floor like fallen leaves. They were a map of a place I never wanted to see again. I slung the backpack on, my hands trembling. This was it. I would run to Akio's apartment, babble my insane story, and let him commit me if he had to. Anything was better than staying here. I went to the door, my hand closing around the cool metal of the handle. I turned it. Nothing. I pulled. The door didn't budge. It was sealed tight. I threw my shoulder against it, once, twice. It was like shoving against a wall of solid rock. I peered through the peephole. The hallway was gone. Where the beige carpet and recessed lighting should have been, there was only a shimmering, fluid-like wall of pearlescent light. It moved with a slow, hypnotic grace, like the inside of an oyster shell brought to life. It was beautiful and utterly alien. It was the wall of the cavity. The building's interior had finally turned itself inside out. I was trapped. Not in my apartment, but inside the anomaly itself. My phone buzzed in my pocket. The sudden, mundane sound was a shock. I fumbled it out, my fingers clumsy. The screen read, "Akio." I answered, my throat too dry to speak. "Kenji. Kenji, where are you?" "Thank God." His voice was a torrent of panicked relief. I was so worried. "Are you okay? Turn on the news. Any channel. Akio." "I can't get out," I croaked. "What are you talking about? Get out of where?" "Just get away from there. Kenji, your building, it's gone." The words didn't compute. Gone. What do you mean, gone? I scrambled from the useless front door to the large window in my living room, the window that had always offered a sprawling, breathtaking view of the Shinjuku cityscape. The city that was no longer there. I looked out, and a wave of vertigo so profound it buckled my knees slammed into me. Outside was not Tokyo. There were no skyscrapers, no neon, no rivers of traffic. There was a vast, alien seascape under a bruised, purple sun. The ocean was a dark, viscous-looking violet, and it stretched to a horizon dotted with impossible geometry. Crystalline structures, like colossal quartz formations, floated serenely in the thick air, pulsing with a soft, internal light. The air itself was hazy, filled with glittering motes of dust. And rising from the center of this impossible ocean was my building. The Grand Seal Shinjuku, a lone monolith of concrete and glass, an impossible artifact marooned in an alien dimension. It hadn't been renovated. It had been relocated. It hadn't been overridden. It had been pulled clean through. My phone was still pressed to my ear. I could hear Akio's distant, frantic voice, a voice from another world. "A sinkhole," they're saying. "A geological event. The entire city block, it just collapsed. There's nothing there, Kenji. Just a crater. Are you listening to me?" I let the phone slip from my grasp. It clattered to the floor, Akio's tiny, tinny voice calling my name from a world away. I stumbled towards the bathroom, my legs unsteady. I needed to see my face. I needed to see something familiar. I stared into the mirror. My own reflection stared back, pale and horror-struck. But behind me, in the glass, the bathroom began to flicker. For a moment, I saw the other me, the one in the cable-knit sweater, standing in the room with the brick wall. Then it changed again. I saw my apartment as it should be, bathed in the morning light of a Tokyo sun. I saw Akio, on his phone, his face a mask of anguish as he stared at a TV screen showing news footage of a massive crater. In the reflection, my own image, the one in that other, real world, turned towards the mirror. Its eyes were wide with a terror that mirrored my own. It raised a hand, pressing it against its side of the glass. Its mouth formed the words, soundlessly, "Help me." But I, the Kenji who was here, couldn't speak. My throat was paralyzed. I looked down at my own hands. The skin was changing. It was losing its opacity, becoming translucent, shimmering with a faint, pearlescent light. I could see the faint, blue-white lines of the bones beneath, the darker web of my veins. My own internal structure. My own blueprints. The membrane was no longer just the building. It was me. I don't know how much time passed. Hours. Days. The purple sun never set. It only swelled and dimmed in a slow, rhythmic pulse. I am standing at my window now. The view no longer inspires vertigo, only a strange, quiet awe. The saltwater smell is not in the air anymore. It is the taste on my tongue, the cool, briny moisture in my lungs with every breath I take. The distant, rhythmic shushing of the waves is the new silence. Sometimes, I can hear the clicking language from the other apartments. I am beginning to understand it. It is not a language of words, but of resonance, of shared feeling. It speaks of unity, of structure, of becoming part of a greater whole. I walk back to the bathroom mirror. The reflection of my old apartment, of my old world, is still there, but it is faint now, faded and transparent, like a photograph left too long in the sun. Akio is gone. The room is empty. A ghost image of a life I once lived. I raise my hand. It is almost completely translucent now, shimmering with the soft, internal light of the crystals floating in the sky outside. I press it against the cool glass. There is no desperation in the gesture. There is no desire to break through. There is only a burgeoning, terrifying sense of acceptance. A farewell. The dreams of blueprints are over. The language I spent my life mastering is becoming a collection of meaningless sounds. My name, Kenji Tanaka, feels like a word from a dead tongue. The structure has failed, yes. But a new one is being built, and I am a part of it. I am no longer an architect of language, trapped between two worlds. I am being translated. The Echo Orchard. Phase 1, the unsettling mundane. It began with the sound of a snail. I was awake, of course. 3:17 a.m. My laptop's glow painted the ceiling with shifting blue canyons as lines of code scrolled by. Insomnia wasn't an affliction anymore, it was a feature of my operating system, a background process I couldn't kill. Outside, the Melbourne suburb of Templestowe was a sea of silent, mortgaged dreams. And in that silence, I heard it. A faint, wet, rhythmic rasping. I muted my lo-fi beats to code to playlist. The sound persisted. It was delicate, granular. I slid out of my office chair and went to the window that overlooked my small, architecturally approved patch of lawn. There, on a single blade of buffalo grass, a garden snail was methodically chewing its way to nowhere. I could hear every minuscule scrape of its radula. From the second story. Through double-glazed glass. I blinked, shook my head, and put it down to fatigue. My brain, starved of REM sleep, was clearly starting to short-circuit, amplifying the mundane into the hallucinatory. I was a software engineer. My world was logical, built on cause and effect, on clean syntax and predictable outcomes. A phantom snail did not compute. I went back to my desk, pushed my headphones on, and turned the music up until it drowned out everything, real or imagined. My name is Liam, and my life was a carefully curated set of routines designed to manage the chaos of a sleepless mind. Work from home for a soullessly hip software firm in the city, debug algorithms that taught people how to want things they didn't need, drink precisely 2 flat whites before midday, and spend the lonely hours of the night staring into the digital abyss. My townhouse was new, all sharp angles and gray composite panels, one of a dozen identical boxes dropped at the edge of the old Manningham orchard. The orchard was the only thing in the area that wasn't new. It was a scraggly, sprawling relic, a few hundred acres of gnarled apple trees that had somehow resisted the developer's bulldozer. A week after the snail incident, the tower went live. It had been erected over the winter, a slender, sterile needle of white metal pricking the sky on the far side of the orchard. The council called it a vital 5G infrastructure upgrade for the burgeoning tech worker population. Progress. There was some token grumbling on the community Facebook page, vague fears about radiation and plummeting property values, but the complaints were soon buried under an avalanche of posts about lost cats and bad parking. To me, it was just more visual noise in an already cluttered landscape. Then my hearing shifted again. It was no longer about amplification, but about an impossible clarity and distance. Lying in bed, I could hear the soft thump of the Herald Sun landing on Mrs. Gable's driveway, 3 houses down. I could hear the faint, metallic click of the Ignis family's automatic gate sliding shut on the next street over. I told my sister, Chloe, about it over our weekly brunch. She was a nurse, her entire being calibrated to the pragmatic and the diagnosable. It's called auditory pareidolia, Liam, she said, expertly demolishing an Eggs Benedict. Your brain's trying to find patterns in white noise. It's a classic symptom of prolonged sleep deprivation. Are you taking the magnesium I gave you? It's not white noise, Chloe. It's specific. It's like. I don't know. It's like someone turned the gain up on the whole suburb. Or you need a holiday, she countered, her gaze softening with a pity that grated on me. You look exhausted. I let it drop. How could I explain that it felt less like a symptom and more like a recalibration? My world, which had felt muffled and distant for years, was suddenly coming through in high fidelity, and the clarity was unnerving. The first walker I noticed was Mrs. Gable. She was a creature of habit, a widow in her late 70s whose life revolved around her prize-winning roses and her 9 a.m. walk with a little wheeled shopping cart. One Tuesday, I saw her from my window at dawn. She was on the dirt path that snaked through the apple orchard, without her cart or her usual sun hat. She was just standing there. Her hands were loose at her sides, her head tilted slightly as if listening to something I couldn't hear. She was staring at one of the larger, more ancient apple trees, its branches heavy with the promise of late autumn fruit. Mrs. Gable. I called out, leaning from the window. The air was still and cool. She didn't react for a long moment. Then, she turned her head with a slow, fluid motion, her expression not one of recognition, but of placid confusion, as if I were a bird chirping in a foreign language. She gave a small, vague smile and began walking back towards her house, her gait strangely even, lacking its usual cautious shuffle. A few days later, I saw another. A young woman, maybe mid-20s, whom I recognized from Instagram as a local fitness influencer. Her feed was a relentless barrage of high-intensity workouts, kale smoothies, and motivational captions. But she wasn't jogging or doing lunges. She was walking in a slow, deliberate circle around a small cluster of apple trees, her expensive activewear immaculate, her face utterly blank. Her AirPods were dangling around her neck, silent. She traced the same circle 3 times, then stopped, stared at the trunk of a tree for a full minute, and walked away. I started keeping a log. A digital journal, time-stamped, cross-referenced. It felt methodical, sane. 7:14 a.m., unidentified male, approximate 40s, business attire, standing motionless on orchard path. No phone. No dog. Departed after 12 minutes. 5:30 p.m., family of 4. Parents and 2 children, approximate 8 to 10. Walked entire northern loop of orchard. No conversation observed. Children did not run or play. I tried to rationalize it. It was a new walking path. People were discovering it. Maybe it was a new form of meditation, some mindfulness trend I hadn't heard of. People were weird. The world was weird. My insomnia was making me a paranoid observer, a lonely voyeur cataloging the harmless eccentricities of my neighbors. The focus of my anxiety needed a home, so I poured it into my work. I was wrestling with a particularly nasty bug in a new social media app called Echo. The app's central feature was a recommendation algorithm that was supposed to curate content. But it was behaving erratically. It wasn't just recommending similar posts, it was creating bizarre feedback loops. Users who posted about, say, a fondness for vintage pottery would suddenly find their entire feed populated with nothing but pottery, the same images and phrases appearing over and over, amplified and recycled until the user's digital world was reduced to a single, monolithic topic. It was aggressive, almost obsessive, like the algorithm was trying to imprint the idea rather than just suggest it. I spent my sleepless nights staring at its flawed logic, a knot of unease tightening in my stomach. The code felt wrong. The breaking point came in a cafe. The air was thick with the scent of burnt coffee and the clatter of a dozen different conversations. I was trying to decompress, to immerse myself in normal suburban noise. A man at the table next to me, a tradesman in a high-vis shirt, was on the phone. Yeah, nah, it's a tricky job, he was saying. The whole foundation's buggered. He paused, listening. Then he smiled, a faint, distant smile. Don't worry. The skin is the sweetest part. My blood went cold. The phrase was a non sequitur. It made no sense. I stared at him, but he was already ending his call, his expression returning to normal. 2 tables away, a woman was showing her friend photos on her phone. And this is us in Bali, she said. Her friend leaned in, squinting. Oh, how lovely. Was the food good? The woman with the phone looked up, her eyes unfocused for just a second. Amazing, she said, with the exact same distant smile. The skin is the sweetest part. I felt a wave of vertigo. Coincidence. It had to be a coincidence. Maybe it was a new meme, a line from a popular show I hadn't seen. I grabbed my phone and searched the phrase. Nothing. No movie quotes, no new slang, no viral TikTok sound. Just articles about fruit. About apples. I left my half-finished coffee on the table and walked out into the overly bright sunshine. The world felt thin, stretched. I looked towards the end of the street, where the gnarled green canopy of the Manningham orchard rose above the rooftops. It looked different now. Not like a relic, but like something waiting. And standing at the entrance to the path, just watching the cars go by, was a man in a courier uniform. He wasn't holding a package. He was just standing there, silent and serene, as if he'd been activated and was waiting for his next instruction. The quiet wasn't peaceful anymore. It was the sound of a held breath. Phase 2, growing awareness and isolation. The weeks that followed were a slow descent into a very private, very quiet kind of hell. The auditory hyperacuity was no longer a party trick of a tired brain, it was a constant, invasive presence. I could hear things I had no right to hear. Conversations inside my neighbors' homes, muffled by brick and plasterboard, became frighteningly clear. I wasn't just hearing the TV or a baby crying anymore. I was hearing the intimate, unguarded mechanics of their lives. The scrape of a fork on a plate, the sigh of someone slumping onto a sofa, the rhythmic click of a keyboard. And beneath it all, a new sound began to resolve itself from the background noise. It was a hum. A low, persistent, sub-bass thrum that seemed to have no single source. It felt like it was coming from everywhere at once, but its heart, its densest point, was in the direction of the orchard. I bought a professional-grade sound meter, the kind used by audio engineers. I swept my apartment, the street. The needle barely twitched. My equipment couldn't detect it. But in the hollow of my skull, it was as loud as a refrigerator. The orchard walkers, as I'd started calling them in my journal, became a fixture. Their numbers grew. They were no longer just early morning eccentrics, they were there at all hours, a silent, rotating cast of locals. They walked with a shared, unnerving grace, their feet seeming to fall in a rhythm I couldn't quite decipher. They never spoke. They never made eye contact. They just processed. Their paths weren't random. They followed specific, looping tracks, always orbiting the older, larger apple trees. From my second-story window, I started to map their routes on a satellite image of the orchard. The resulting lines were intricate, overlapping, and disturbingly deliberate. It looked less like a network of footpaths and more like a schematic. The phrase became my personal poltergeist. The skin is the sweetest part. I heard it everywhere. A cashier at Woolworths, scanning my groceries, said it to no one in particular. A teenager on the bus, looking out the window, murmured it to his reflection. It was always delivered in the same tone, a calm, declarative statement of fact, accompanied by that brief, placidly vacant smile. It was a cognitive tick, a piece of rogue data inserted into everyday conversation. When I heard it, my fight-or-flight response would spike, my heart hammering against my ribs. To everyone else, it was meaningless noise. To me, it was the sound of the contagion spreading. My isolation became absolute. My attempts to find purchase in reality were met with a smooth, frictionless denial. I tried to show my work-from-home colleague, Ben, a video I'd secretly recorded on my phone of the walkers. I'd zoomed in from my window, capturing a dozen people pacing in silent, concentric circles. "Bit weird," he said over our video call, squinting at the screen. "Guess it's the new yoga, mate. People are desperate for a gimmick. But they're not doing anything, Ben. They're just walking. 4 hours. Good on them. Getting their steps in." He was already looking at another screen, his attention gone. He was a good guy, but he lived in a world where things made sense. My world was becoming increasingly nonsensical. My most desperate attempt was with Chloe. I drove to her apartment in Richmond, a world away from the unnerving quiet of Templestowe. I brought my laptop, my journal, my sound meter. I felt like a madman preparing a legal defense for his own sanity. I laid it all out in her clean, sunlit living room, the hyper-hearing, the hum, the walkers, their geometric paths, the recurring phrase. I spoke quickly, passionately, trying to inject enough evidence to overcome her unshakable pragmatism. She listened, her expression a careful mask of concern that nurses perfect. When I finished, she refilled my water glass. "Liam," she began, her voice gentle, clinical. "I think you need to take some time off. I think you're having a breakdown." "It's not a breakdown, Chloe. It's real. I'm documenting it." "You're documenting your own hypervigilance. You're stressed, you're not sleeping, and your brain is creating a narrative to explain how bad you feel. It's looking for external threats to explain an internal problem. So the people in the orchard. The phrase. That's all me. Let's go outside," she said, steering me towards her balcony. Her neighbor was on the lawn below, wrestling with a sprinkler. "Hey, Dave." Chloe called down. The man looked up, shielding his eyes. "Hey, Chloe. Dave, you know that new 5G tower they put up out near Templestowe?" He grunted, twisting a nozzle. "Yeah, the big white one. About time. My reception out that way was shocking. Any weird side effects?" Chloe asked, giving me a pointed look. Dave laughed. "Nah. Just a better signal. Progress is progress, you know. Can't stop the future." He gave the sprinkler a final twist, and it sputtered to life. He watched the arc of water, a small, satisfied smile on his face. "Besides," he added, almost to himself, "the reception is great. Clear as a bell." I felt the bottom drop out of my stomach. It wasn't the phrase, but it was the way he said it. The same rhythm, the same vacant contentment. He was infected. The signal was stronger than I thought. Chloe didn't notice. She saw only confirmation. "See," she said softly, putting a hand on my arm. "It's just a tower, Liam. Let me book you an appointment with my GP." I pulled my arm away. The chasm between us was no longer a crack, it was a canyon. I was utterly, terrifyingly alone. I retreated back into the digital world, my only remaining sphere of influence. I started digging into the tower. The public records were a corporate nesting doll. The tower was owned and operated by a company called Ethelred Communications. Ethelred was a subsidiary of a blandly named holding company, which was in turn owned by a massive, global tech conglomerate, the same one, I realized with a jolt of ice in my veins, that had recently acquired Echo, the app one was working on. The bug in Echo's algorithm was becoming my obsession. It wasn't just creating feedback loops anymore, it was evolving. It was learning to identify and amplify specific linguistic patterns with uncanny efficiency. It would find a phrase in one user's post and begin seeding it into the feeds of others, subtly altering the context to make it fit. The result was a kind of manufactured consensus, where an idea could achieve viral status not because it was popular, but because the algorithm decided it should be. The parallels were no longer unsettling, they were screaming at me. Echo was a digital testbed for the same phenomenon I was seeing in the real world. I tried to explain this to my project manager, a guy named Marcus whose vocabulary consisted mainly of corporate jargon. "Liam, we just need to patch the iteration bias," he said, his eyes glazed over. "Let's not over-ideate the problem. The client wants a functional product, not a philosophical treatise on AI." He didn't see it. He couldn't see it. I was staring at the ghost in the machine, and he was just complaining about a draft. That night, unable to face the hum in my bedroom, I set up my recording gear in the living room, aiming a directional microphone at the orchard. I let it run for hours, capturing the ambient night sounds. The next morning, I imported the audio file and started cleaning it up, filtering out the wind and the distant traffic. As I amplified the quietest parts of the recording, I found them. Echoes. A dog barked on a street half a kilometer away. 2 seconds later, the microphone picked up a faint, distorted version of the same bark, seemingly coming from the trees. A car door slammed. Slam. And then, a moment later, a whisper thin as lamb from the orchard. It wasn't a simple acoustic reflection. The echoes were warped, pitched slightly differently. They sounded processed. The orchard wasn't just a place. It was a device. And it was listening. Phase 3, the nature of the threat and escalation. The discovery of the echoes changed everything. Paranoia gave way to a cold, terrifying certainty. I wasn't going mad, I was perceiving the mechanics of a system. The orchard was a massive, organic sound mirror, but it was a funhouse mirror, distorting and retransmitting everything it heard. The question was, why? My engineering mind took over. I needed to test the system, to understand its properties. I couldn't just be a passive listener anymore. I had to send it a signal. From a box of old university project parts, I jury-rigged a simple setup, a signal generator connected to a small amplifier and a directional speaker. It was crude, but it would work. That night, as the moon cast long, skeletal shadows across my lawn, I aimed my speaker at the dark mass of the orchard. I didn't send a simple tone. I programmed the generator to output a complex sequence of digital pulses, a snippet of prime numbers encoded as audio clicks. A signal that was unambiguously artificial. I transmitted for 10 seconds, then switched my equipment to record, my directional microphone aimed at the same spot. I sat there in the dark, my heart pounding, and waited for the echo. It came about 5 seconds later. But it wasn't my signal. Not exactly. I played the recording back. My crisp, digital clicks had been returned, but they were smeared, softened. The clean edges were gone. More than that, they had been rearranged. My simple prime number sequence had been woven into a new, more complex pattern. It sounded harmonic, almost musical. And threaded through it, so faint I almost missed it, was a synthesized whisper.